The sterile hospital corridors echoed with the sound of rushing footsteps and urgent voices. Sarah Mitchell gripped the metal railings of her hospital bed as another contraction tore through her body. The fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting shadows that danced across the white walls like ghosts of her past. Through the haze of pain, she heard the voice she had hoped never to hear again. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Dr. James Harrison. I'll be delivering your baby tonight." Sarah's blood ran cold. The man standing before her in surgical scrubs was the same man who had destroyed her life 3 years ago. The same man who had taken everything from her and left her with nothing but shattered dreams and a broken heart. James Harrison, her ex-husband, now stood as the only thing between her and the safe delivery of her child. You won't believe what happened when fate decided to play the cruelest joke imaginable on a woman about to give birth. But to understand how Sarah Mitchell found herself in this impossible situation, we need to go back to where it all began. Sarah had always been the kind of person who believed in second chances and the goodness of people. Growing up in a small farming community outside of Nashville, she learned the value of hard work from her father, a veterinarian who spent his days healing wounded animals, and compassion from her mother, a school teacher who never gave up on any student. Sarah's childhood home was filled with the constant sound of injured animals recovering in makeshift kennels her father had built in their basement. The smell of antiseptic mixed with her mother's lavender candles created an oddly comforting atmosphere that taught Sarah that healing and love could coexist even in the darkest moments. She remembered countless nights falling asleep to the soft whimpering of a wounded raccoon or the gentle purring of a recovering cat. Her parents, Robert and Linda Mitchell, had met during a thunderstorm when Linda's car broke down outside Robert's veterinary clinic. Linda always said it was destiny that brought them together that night, and Sarah grew up believing in that kind of magical love. She watched her parents dance in the kitchen every Sunday morning while making pancakes, witnessed her father bringing her mother wildflowers from his rounds in the countryside, and saw how they held hands during her father's battle with cancer when Sarah was 15. When Robert Mitchell lost his fight against lung cancer, something shifted in Sarah's worldview. She decided to dedicate her life to healing people the way her father had healed animals. She worked 3 jobs to put herself through nursing school, studying by candlelight when the electricity was shut off, surviving on peanut butter sandwiches and determination. Her mother Linda supported her every step of the way, even when it meant selling the family farm to pay for Sarah's education. During her second year of nursing school at Vanderbilt University, Sarah met James Harrison in the medical library. He was a fourth-year medical student with perfectly styled blonde hair, designer clothes, and the kind of confident smile that made professors remember his name. James came from old Nashville money. His father was a prominent cardiovascular surgeon, and his mother hosted charity galas that made the society pages. James seemed fascinated by Sarah's humble background and genuine nature, telling his friends he had found someone authentic in a world full of pretenders. Their courtship was a whirlwind of expensive dinners, weekend trips to his family's lake house, and promises of a future together. James would show up at the hospital where Sarah was doing her clinical rotations with coffee and pastries from the city's most expensive bakery. He introduced her to his world of country club memberships and private boxes at Titans games, making her feel like Cinderella at the ball. Sarah's mother Linda was cautious about James from the beginning, sensing something calculated in his charm, but Sarah was completely smitten. "He's not like us, sweetheart," Linda had warned during one of their phone calls. "Rich boys like that, they play with girls like you. They don't marry them." But Sarah refused to listen. James seemed different. He talked about wanting to do meaningful work, about opening a free clinic for underprivileged children, about changing the healthcare system from within. He made Sarah believe they were partners in a shared mission to heal the world. When he proposed during her graduation ceremony, presenting her with a 3-carat diamond ring in front of all her classmates, Sarah felt like her fairy tale was complete. The wedding was everything James's family wanted and nothing Sarah recognized. The Harrison family's estate was transformed into a Southern Gothic masterpiece with white roses flown in from Ecuador, a string quartet that had played for 3 governors, and a guest list that read like Nashville's social register. Sarah felt like an actor in someone else's play, smiling and nodding as strangers praised her for landing such a catch. Her mother Linda sat alone at a small table in the back, looking beautiful but out of place in her second-hand dress that Sarah had helped her alter. During the reception, Sarah overheard James's college fraternity brothers making crude bets about how long the marriage would last. 6 months, laughed Chad Morrison, whose family owned half of downtown Nashville. Jimmy always gets bored with his charity cases. Sarah pretended she hadn't heard, but something cold settled in her stomach that night, a whisper of doubt she tried desperately to ignore. The first year of their marriage was a carefully choreographed performance. James was completing his residency in obstetrics and gynecology at Nashville General Hospital while Sarah worked as a night shift nurse in the same hospital's emergency department. They lived in a penthouse apartment James's father had purchased as a wedding gift, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Cumberland River and furniture that cost more than Sarah's mother made in a year. Sarah threw herself into her work, finding purpose in caring for patients who reminded her of her childhood neighbors back home. She volunteered for the most difficult shifts, comforted families during their darkest hours, and earned a reputation among the hospital staff as someone who genuinely cared. Meanwhile, James excelled in his residency, charming attending physicians with his family connections and natural surgical skills. To the outside world, they looked like the perfect medical power couple. But behind closed doors, cracks were beginning to show. James would come home from the hospital and immediately pour himself a scotch, complaining about having to work with inferior colleagues and difficult patients. He began making disparaging comments about Sarah's background, suggesting she was too emotional for emergency medicine and should consider transferring to pediatrics or geriatrics, departments he viewed as less prestigious. When Sarah tried to discuss their future plans, including starting a family and maybe opening that free clinic James had once talked about, he would dismiss her concerns and change the subject. The breaking point came during their second year of marriage. Sarah had been feeling unwell for weeks, experiencing nausea and fatigue that she initially attributed to her demanding work schedule. When she finally took a pregnancy test, the positive result filled her with a joy she had never experienced. She imagined James's reaction, picturing him lifting her off her feet with excitement, calling his parents to share the news, immediately starting to plan for their baby's future. Instead, when Sarah told James about the pregnancy over dinner at their favorite restaurant, his face went completely white. He set down his wine glass with trembling hands and stared at her as if she had just told him she had a terminal illness. "This can't be happening right now," he whispered, looking around the restaurant nervously. "I'm not ready for this, Sarah. My career is just getting started. My father expects me to complete a fellowship at Johns Hopkins. This changes everything." Sarah felt her heart breaking in real time. "I thought you wanted children," she managed to say through tears that were threatening to spill over. "You always talked about having a family. Someday, maybe. But not now. Not like this." James's voice was cold and clinical, the same tone he used when delivering bad news to patients' families. "You need to take care of this, Sarah. We can try again in a few years when the timing is better." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She realized in that moment that she had never really known the man she had married. The James Harrison sitting across from her was not the compassionate medical student who had promised to change the world alongside her. This was someone else entirely, someone who could casually suggest ending the life they had created together as if it were nothing more than an inconvenient scheduling conflict. Sarah left the restaurant that night and drove straight to her mother's small apartment on the outskirts of Nashville. Linda Mitchell took one look at her daughter's tear-stained face and knew something terrible had happened. Over cups of chamomile tea at the kitchen table where Sarah had done her homework as a child, she told her mother everything. Linda listened without judgment, holding Sarah's hands while she sobbed, promising that whatever decision Sarah made, she would have her mother's complete support. What would you do in this situation? Tell us in the comments below. The confrontation with James the next morning was even worse than Sarah had anticipated. He was already dressed for the hospital when she returned to their apartment, his face set in a kind of cold, professional mask she had seen him wear during difficult surgeries. There was no concern for her well-being, no questions about where she had spent the night, no apparent recognition that his words had shattered their marriage. "I've been thinking about our conversation," James said without preamble, adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror. "I've made an appointment for you this afternoon with Dr. Rebecca Chen. She's discreet and efficient. The whole thing will be over in an hour, and we can move on with our lives." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "You made an appointment? Without even talking to me first?" "Sarah, be practical. We both have careers to think about. This is the smart choice." James's voice carried the same condescending tone he used when explaining medical procedures to patients he considered uneducated. "I've already told Dr. Chen that you'll be there at 3 o'clock. "I'm not going," Sarah said quietly, her hand instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. "I'm keeping our baby." For the first time since she had known him, James lost his composure completely. His face flushed red with anger, and he slammed his briefcase down on the marble countertop with enough force to make Sarah jump. "Don't be ridiculous," he shouted. "You can't raise a child on a nurse's salary. You don't have the resources or the connections to give this kid the life it deserves. You're being selfish and stupid." "Selfish?" Sarah's own anger finally broke through her shock and hurt. "I'm being selfish for wanting to protect our child. What about you, James? What about your responsibility as a father?" "I'm not ready to be a father." James's voice echoed off the apartment's high ceilings. "And frankly, Sarah, I don't think I ever will be. Not with you." The silence that followed those words was deafening. Sarah felt something fundamental break inside her chest, like a bone snapping under too much pressure. She looked around the expensive apartment with its pristine furniture and stunning city views, realizing for the first time that none of it had ever really been hers. She was just another beautiful object James had acquired to enhance his image, and now that she was no longer serving that purpose, she had become disposable. "I want a divorce," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I want you out of my life and out of our baby's life." James laughed, a harsh sound devoid of any warmth or humor. "Good luck with that, sweetheart. You signed a prenup, remember? You'll walk away with exactly what you came into this marriage with, which was nothing. And if you think you're going to get child support or alimony from me, you're even more naive than I thought." Sarah remembered the prenuptial agreement she had signed without really reading it, trusting James when he said it was just a formality his father's lawyers required. She had been so in love, so grateful to be accepted into his world, that she had signed away her rights without even realizing it. Now she understood the real reason James's fraternity brothers had made those cruel bets at their wedding reception. This had always been a temporary arrangement for him. Over the following weeks, Sarah learned exactly how ruthless the Harrison family could be when protecting their interests. James hired the most expensive divorce attorney in Nashville, a shark named Victoria Pemberton who specialized in destroying the opposition through character assassination and financial warfare. Sarah, meanwhile, could barely afford a public defender who was handling 30 other cases simultaneously. The divorce proceedings became a public humiliation. James's legal team painted Sarah as a gold-digging opportunist who had deliberately gotten pregnant to trap a wealthy doctor. They produced witnesses who testified that Sarah had been seen researching James's family wealth online before they started dating, conveniently ignoring the fact that she had been studying for a medical terminology exam and had looked up medical terms, not financial information. They claimed she had a history of emotional instability, presenting her tearful reaction to her father's death as evidence of mental illness. Most cruelly, they attacked Sarah's pregnancy itself, suggesting she had been unfaithful and that James might not even be the biological father. James sat in the courtroom during these hearings with his face composed and an expression of wounded dignity, playing the role of the betrayed husband to perfection. Sarah watched the man she had once loved transform into someone she didn't recognize, someone capable of destroying her reputation and emotional well-being without apparent remorse. The final divorce hearing took place on a rainy Thursday morning in October. Sarah was 6 months pregnant by then, her growing belly making it impossible to hide her condition from the reporters and photographers who had begun following the case. The Harrison family's influence had turned what should have been a private matter into a media circus, with local news stations running stories about the gold-digging nurse trying to steal money from Nashville's most prominent medical family. Judge Margaret Whitfield, a stern woman in her 60s who had a reputation for fairness, listened to both sides present their closing arguments. Victoria Pemberton painted a picture of Sarah as a manipulative woman who had seduced an innocent medical student and was now trying to cash in on her pregnancy. Sarah's overworked public defender, a kind but ineffective man named David Park, did his best to present the truth, but he was clearly outmatched by the Harrison family's legal artillery. When Judge Whitfield delivered her verdict, Sarah felt her last hope die. The prenuptial agreement was upheld in its entirety. Sarah would receive no alimony, no share of the marital assets, and no ongoing financial support. The judge did order James to pay child support, but the amount was calculated based on what a resident physician would typically earn, not the trust fund income James actually lived on. It would barely cover the cost of diapers and formula. Worse still, James was granted generous visitation rights, despite his clear statement that he wanted nothing to do with the child. His lawyers argued that he had a right to maintain a relationship with his biological offspring, and Judge Whitfield agreed. Sarah realized this was just another way for James to maintain control over her life, ensuring he could continue to torment her even after their marriage was dissolved. Can you guess what happens next? Drop your predictions below. As Sarah left the courthouse that day, soaked by the cold October rain and surrounded by reporters shouting questions she couldn't bear to answer, she felt completely alone for the first time in her adult life. Her mother Linda was dying of the same lung cancer that had killed her father, though Sarah had kept this news from James throughout their divorce proceedings, knowing he would find a way to use it against her. The hospital where she worked had become an uncomfortable environment, with colleagues whispering about her personal life and some treating her differently because of the negative publicity. Sarah moved back into her childhood bedroom in her mother's small apartment, sleeping in the same twin bed where she had once dreamed of becoming a doctor herself someday. The walls were still covered with her high school achievement awards and college acceptance letters, reminders of the ambitious young woman she had once been before James Harrison entered her life. Now, at 26 years old and 7 months pregnant, she felt like her future had been reduced to a series of survival challenges. Linda Mitchell was in the advanced stages of lung cancer by then, though she tried to hide her pain and weakness from her daughter. Sarah would come home from her shifts at the hospital to find her mother sitting in their small living room, wrapped in blankets and working on a baby quilt she was hand-sewing for her future grandchild. The quilt was made from scraps of fabric Linda had saved over the years, pieces from Sarah's childhood dresses, her father's old shirts, and curtains from the farmhouse they had lost after Robert's death. "This baby is going to be surrounded by love," Linda would say, her voice weak but determined. "No matter what that Harrison boy thinks, this child is going to know where they come from and what really matters in life." Sarah's pregnancy progressed normally, despite the emotional stress she was under. She continued working full-time at Nashville General Hospital, partly because she needed the money and partly because staying busy kept her from dwelling on her uncertain future. Her colleagues in the emergency department had rallied around her once they learned the truth about her situation, with many sharing their own stories of difficult divorces and single parenthood. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the head of emergency medicine and a single mother herself, became Sarah's unofficial mentor during this period. Elena was a tough, no-nonsense physician who had worked her way up from nothing, emigrating from Guatemala as a child and earning her medical degree through scholarships and sheer determination. She recognized something of herself in Sarah's situation and made sure the younger woman was protected from hospital politics and gossip. "Men like your ex-husband think they can throw money around and make their problems disappear," Elena told Sarah during one of their coffee breaks. "But what they don't understand is that strong women raise strong children. Your baby is going to be fine, Mija. Better than fine." Elena's words proved prophetic in ways Sarah couldn't have imagined. As her due date approached, Sarah began experiencing what she thought were false labor pains during a particularly busy night shift. She was treating a car accident victim when the contractions became too intense to ignore. Dr. Rodriguez took one look at Sarah's face and immediately called for a wheelchair. "This baby is coming tonight," Elena announced, personally escorting Sarah to the maternity ward upstairs. "And I'm not taking any chances with my best nurse." The maternity ward at Nashville General Hospital was understaffed that night due to a flu outbreak among the medical personnel. Dr. Patricia Wells, the attending obstetrician Sarah had chosen for her delivery, was home with a high fever. The backup physician was stuck in surgery with complications from an earlier cesarean section. As Sarah's contractions grew stronger and more frequent, the nursing staff began making frantic calls to find an available doctor. That's when Sarah heard the voice she had hoped never to hear again. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Dr. James Harrison. I'll be delivering your baby tonight." Sarah's labor pains were immediately overshadowed by a different kind of agony. James stood in the doorway of her hospital room wearing surgical scrubs, his hair covered by a blue cap, looking every inch the professional physician. But Sarah could see something else in his eyes, something cold and calculating that made her stomach clench with fear. "No," Sarah whispered, shaking her head weakly. "I don't want you here. Get someone else." "I'm afraid that's not possible," James replied, his voice clinically professional. "I'm the only obstetrician available tonight, and your baby needs to be delivered immediately. Your cervix is fully dilated, and I can see the head crowning. There's no time to wait for another doctor." The labor nurse, a kind older woman named Margaret Thompson, looked back and forth between Sarah and James with obvious confusion. She clearly sensed the tension but didn't understand its source. "Doctor, should I call for another physician? The patient seems uncomfortable with." "The patient is experiencing normal anxiety associated with active labor," James interrupted smoothly. "It's completely normal. We need to focus on delivering this baby safely." Sarah felt trapped and helpless, her body betraying her at the moment she most needed to be strong. Another contraction tore through her abdomen, this one so powerful she couldn't speak. James moved to the foot of the bed and began positioning the stirrups, his movements efficient and impersonal. "I can see the head," he announced to the room. "Sarah, you need to push with the next contraction." Hearing her name in his voice felt like a violation. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to focus on the baby, her baby, who deserved to be born safely regardless of the circumstances. She pushed with everything she had, feeling her child moving down the birth canal, getting closer to meeting the world. "Good," James said, his voice betraying no emotion. "The head is out. One more push should do it." Sarah pushed again, and suddenly she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her baby's first cry. Tears streamed down her face as she heard that strong, healthy wail, the sound of her child announcing their arrival to the universe. "It's a girl," James announced, holding up Sarah's daughter for everyone to see. "She's beautiful." For just a moment, Sarah saw something flicker across James's face as he looked at their daughter. The clinical mask slipped for just an instant, and she saw wonder, pride, and something that might have been love. Their baby was perfect, with a full head of dark hair and Sarah's stubborn chin, crying lustily as Margaret Thompson gently cleaned her off. But then the moment passed, and James's professional demeanor returned. He cut the umbilical cord with steady hands, handed the baby to the nurse, and began the routine post-delivery procedures. Sarah watched him work, noting how his hands trembled slightly as he completed the delivery of the placenta and checked for tears or complications. "Everything looks good," he told Margaret Thompson, stripping off his surgical gloves. "Standard post-delivery instructions. I'll write up the discharge orders." He turned to leave without another word, but Sarah found her voice. "James, wait." He stopped in the doorway but didn't turn around. "Congratulations, Sarah. She's a lucky little girl." What followed were the most exhausting and rewarding months of Sarah's life. She named her daughter Emma Rose, after her grandmother and her mother's favorite flower. Emma was a healthy, alert baby with an easy temperament and her father's bright blue eyes. Sarah threw herself into motherhood with the same dedication she had once brought to her nursing career, determined to give her daughter everything she needed despite their limited resources. Linda Mitchell lived long enough to hold her granddaughter, and the joy on her face during those precious weeks was worth every hardship Sarah had endured. Linda passed away peacefully in her sleep when Emma was 3 months old, leaving Sarah truly alone but also leaving her the small apartment and a life insurance policy that would help support Emma through her early years. The grief of losing her mother was overwhelming, but Sarah didn't have the luxury of falling apart. Emma needed her to be strong, needed her to work and provide and create a stable home. Sarah returned to her job at Nashville General Hospital after her maternity leave ended, working the night shift so she could care for Emma during the day and sleep in brief intervals whenever the baby napped. Elena Rodriguez helped Sarah arrange for childcare during her shifts, connecting her with Maria Santos, a grandmother who cared for several children of hospital employees in her home near the medical center. Maria was a godsend, treating Emma like her own granddaughter and refusing to charge Sarah the full rate for her services. "This little angel deserves all the love in the world," Maria would say, rocking Emma to sleep in the evening when Sarah arrived to pick her up. "You're doing a good job, Mija. Don't let anyone tell you different." James, meanwhile, had completed his residency and accepted a fellowship position at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, just as he had always planned. He had made no contact with Sarah since the night Emma was born, despite the court-ordered visitation rights he had fought so hard to obtain. The child support checks arrived precisely on schedule each month, but they came from his lawyer's office with no personal note or acknowledgement of Emma's existence. Sarah was simultaneously relieved and hurt by James's absence. She didn't want him disrupting Emma's routine or confusing her daughter with his emotional unavailability, but part of her had hoped that seeing Emma might awaken some paternal instincts in him. Instead, his complete disinterest felt like another rejection, another reminder that Sarah and Emma meant nothing to the Harrison family. Life settled into a predictable rhythm for Sarah and Emma. Sarah worked her shifts, cared for her daughter, and slowly began rebuilding her emotional strength. She made friends with other single mothers in her apartment complex, women who understood the challenges of raising children alone and who created an informal support network for each other. Emma thrived in this environment, surrounded by love from her mother and the extended family Sarah had chosen for them. But then something incredible happened that would change everything. Sarah was working a particularly busy Friday night shift in the emergency department when Dr. Rodriguez approached her with an unusual request. A wealthy elderly patient named Harold Whitman had been admitted earlier that evening after suffering a mild heart attack. Mr. Whitman was stable and recovering well, but he had specifically requested that Sarah be assigned as his primary nurse. "I don't understand," Sarah told Dr. Rodriguez. "I've never met anyone named Harold Whitman. Why would he ask for me specifically?" "He says he knows your family," Elena replied with a shrug. "He's been asking about you since he arrived. Seems like a nice old gentleman. Very well dressed, very polite. He's in room 12 if you want to go introduce yourself." Sarah walked down the hallway to room 12 with curiosity and a bit of apprehension. She couldn't think of any wealthy elderly men who would know her family, especially not well enough to request her as a nurse. When she entered the room, she found a distinguished-looking man in his early 70s sitting up in bed, wearing silk pajamas and a warm smile. "You must be Sarah," he said, extending his hand for her to shake. "I'm Harold Whitman, but you can call me Harry. I was hoping we'd have a chance to meet." Sarah shook his hand politely but remained puzzled. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitman, but I don't think we've met before. How do you know my family?" Harry's eyes twinkled with what looked like mischief. "I knew your father, Robert Mitchell. We served together in Vietnam, though we lost touch after the war. I've been trying to track him down for years, and I was heartbroken to learn that he passed away. When I found out his daughter worked here at the hospital, I knew I had to meet you." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. Her father had rarely talked about his time in the military, and she knew almost nothing about his service record or the friends he had made during the war. "You served with my dad. Robert saved my life," Harry said simply. "We were in a helicopter that went down in the jungle near Da Nang. Your father pulled me out of the wreckage and carried me 3 miles through enemy territory to reach a medical evacuation point. I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for Robert Mitchell." Tears began to form in Sarah's eyes as she listened to this stranger tell her things about her father she had never known. Harry reached into his bedside table and pulled out an old black and white photograph showing 2 young soldiers in uniform, arms around each other's shoulders and grinning at the camera. One of them was unmistakably her father, though Sarah had never seen him look so young and carefree. "He talked about you all the time," Harry continued, his voice soft with memory. "He was so proud of his little girl who wanted to be a doctor someday. He carried your school pictures in his wallet and showed them to anyone who would look. Robert was the best man I ever knew, Sarah. He had a heart as big as the sky." Sarah couldn't hold back her tears any longer. She sat down in the chair beside Harry's bed and listened as he told her story after story about her father's kindness and courage during the war. Harry had gone on to become a successful businessman after returning from Vietnam, building a small construction company into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, but he had never forgotten the debt he owed to Robert Mitchell. "I've been looking for your family for over 20 years, Harry explained. I wanted to thank Robert properly, maybe help him out if he needed anything. When I finally tracked down your address and learned that he had died, I felt like I had failed him somehow. But then I found out about you, and I knew Robert would want me to look after his daughter." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Mr. Whitman, that's very kind, but I'm doing fine on my own. I don't need charity." Harry laughed, a sound full of warmth and genuine affection. "Robert's daughter, all right. Too proud for your own good, just like he was. This isn't charity, Sarah. This is family taking care of family. And please, call me Harry." Over the next few hours, as Sarah monitored Harry's condition and helped with his recovery, he told her more about his successful business and his life after the war. He had married his college sweetheart and raised 3 children, but his wife had died of cancer 5 years earlier and his children lived scattered across the country with families of their own. He was lonely, he admitted, and meeting Sarah felt like a gift from his old friend Robert. When Harry was discharged from the hospital 3 days later, he left his business card with Sarah and a standing invitation to call him anytime she needed anything. Sarah tucked the card into her wallet, touched by the connection to her father but not expecting to see the elderly businessman again. She had learned to be self-reliant, and accepting help from strangers felt uncomfortable, even when those strangers had known her father. But Harry Whitman was not the type of man to give up easily. Over the following weeks, he began showing up at unexpected moments in Sarah's life. He would appear in the hospital cafeteria during her dinner break, armed with coffee and stories about her father. He started sending toys and books for Emma, beautiful, expensive gifts that Sarah initially tried to return but that Harry insisted were simply tokens of his affection for Robert's granddaughter. "Your father saved my life," Harry would remind Sarah whenever she protested his generosity. "The least I can do is spoil his granddaughter a little bit." Emma, now 18 months old and walking confidently, took to Harry immediately. She would toddle toward him with outstretched arms whenever he visited, chattering in her developing vocabulary and climbing onto his lap to look at picture books. Harry seemed to come alive when he was with Emma, his face lighting up with genuine joy as he played peekaboo or built towers with wooden blocks for her to knock down. Sarah found herself looking forward to Harry's visits more than she cared to admit. He was kind and funny and genuinely interested in her life and Emma's development. He asked thoughtful questions about Sarah's work and listened intently when she talked about her hopes for Emma's future. Most importantly, he never made Sarah feel like a charity case or a burden. Instead, he made her feel valued and respected, like someone whose friendship was worthwhile. Little did she know, Harry had been quietly investigating Sarah's situation and learning about her disastrous marriage to James Harrison. Harry was a successful businessman precisely because he was thorough and strategic in his approach to problems, and he had quickly identified James as the source of most of Sarah's current difficulties. What Harry discovered about the Harrison family and their treatment of Sarah made his blood boil with righteous anger. Harry had built his construction empire by being fair in his dealings and generous to his employees. He believed in taking care of the people who worked for him, and he had never forgotten where he came from or the friends who had helped him along the way. The idea that Robert Mitchell's daughter was struggling financially while her wealthy ex-husband lived in luxury was unacceptable to Harry. He began quietly formulating a plan to even the scales. The first step in Harry's plan came 6 months after they met. He approached Sarah with a business proposition that seemed too good to be true. Harry's company was expanding into healthcare facility construction, and he needed a consultant who understood hospital operations from the ground up. Would Sarah be interested in a part-time consulting position that would allow her to maintain her nursing schedule but provide additional income? "I don't know anything about construction," Sarah protested. "I'm a nurse, not a business consultant." "That's exactly why I need you," Harry replied. "I can hire construction experts anywhere. What I need is someone who understands how hospitals actually function, someone who knows what makes a medical facility efficient and comfortable for both patients and staff. You've worked in emergency medicine for years. You know better than any architect what works and what doesn't." The consulting fee Harry offered was generous enough that Sarah could reduce her hospital shifts and spend more time with Emma. She would still work as a nurse 3 nights a week, but the consulting work would provide financial stability and professional growth opportunities she had never imagined possible. After much consideration and discussion with Dr. Rodriguez, Sarah accepted Harry's offer. Working with Harry opened up a whole new world for Sarah. She discovered she had a natural aptitude for healthcare facility design and project management. Her insights into patient flow, staff efficiency, and emergency protocols proved invaluable to Harry's construction teams. She began traveling to job sites, reviewing architectural plans, and presenting recommendations to hospital administrators. For the first time since her divorce, Sarah felt intellectually challenged and professionally respected. Emma thrived during this period as well. Harry had arranged for her to attend a high-quality daycare center near his office, where she was surrounded by other children and caring teachers. In the evenings, Sarah would pick Emma up and they would often have dinner with Harry at his sprawling estate outside Nashville. Emma had her own room at Harry's house, decorated with hand-painted murals and filled with toys and books. Harry doted on her like the grandfather she had never had, teaching her to identify birds in his garden and reading her bedtime stories in funny voices that made her giggle. Sarah sometimes felt guilty about how much her life had improved since meeting Harry. She worked hard for everything he paid her, but she knew his generosity went far beyond normal business relationships. Harry was creating opportunities for her that she never could have achieved on her own, and he was providing Emma with experiences and advantages that Sarah's nursing salary never could have afforded. "Your father saved my life," Harry reminded her whenever she tried to thank him. "Everything I've accomplished since Vietnam, every success I've had, every day I've been alive, I owe to Robert Mitchell. Taking care of his family isn't charity, Sarah. It's an honor." But Harry's kindness was about to be tested in ways he never could have anticipated. James Harrison returned to Nashville after completing his fellowship at Johns Hopkins, ready to establish himself as one of the city's premier obstetricians. He had secured a position at Nashville General Hospital's new Women's Center, a state-of-the-art facility that catered to the city's wealthiest families. James had also married during his time in Baltimore, wedding the daughter of a prominent plastic surgeon in a ceremony that made the society pages of both Nashville and Baltimore newspapers. Sarah learned about James's return through hospital gossip long before she encountered him personally. Nurses in the maternity ward whispered about the handsome new doctor who drove a Mercedes and wore custom-tailored suits. They speculated about his beautiful wife, Rebecca Harrison, who had attended Wellesley College and spoke 3 languages fluently. To most of the hospital staff, James appeared to be the perfect successful physician, charming and competent and destined for greatness. Sarah tried to avoid any departments where she might encounter James, but Nashville General Hospital wasn't large enough for them to never cross paths. Their first meeting since Emma's birth happened in the hospital elevator on a Tuesday morning. Sarah was heading to a meeting with hospital administrators about a construction project Harry's company was bidding on when James stepped into the elevator on the 4th floor. The recognition was immediate and mutual. James looked exactly as Sarah remembered him, perfectly groomed and expensively dressed, but there was something different in his eyes now. Where once there had been the cold calculation that had destroyed their marriage, she saw something she never expected to see again. Concern. Real, genuine concern. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "You're in active labor." She gripped the hospital bed rails, her knuckles white as another contraction tore through her body. "I know that," she gasped through gritted teeth. "What I don't know is why my ex-husband is standing in my delivery room." Dr. James Mitchell adjusted his surgical mask, his hands already moving with practiced efficiency as he checked her vitals. "Dr. Patterson had a family emergency. I'm covering all deliveries tonight." He paused, meeting her eyes. "Sarah, I need you to trust me. This baby is breech, and we need to act fast." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The man who had abandoned her when she needed him most was now the only person who could safely deliver their child's half-sibling. Because what James didn't know yet was that the baby Sarah was carrying belonged to his younger brother, Michael. You won't believe what happened when the doctor who broke her heart became the only person who could save her life. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back 18 months earlier, when Sarah Collins was still Sarah Mitchell, and her world was about to crumble in the most public way possible. Sarah had always been the type of woman who believed in fairy tales. Not the Disney kind with singing animals and magic wands, but the real kind. The kind where love conquers all, where hard work pays off, and where good people get happy endings. At 28, she was head nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, known for her gentle touch with patients and her ability to remain calm under pressure. Her colleagues respected her, her patients adored her, and her husband of 3 years, Dr. James Mitchell, was the golden boy of the cardiothoracic surgery department. They lived in a sprawling colonial house in the suburbs, complete with a white picket fence and a golden retriever named Buster. Sarah had converted the spare bedroom into a nursery, painted in soft yellow because they wanted to be surprised. The crib was antique white, handed down from James's grandmother, and Sarah would sometimes stand in the doorway, one hand resting on her still flat stomach, imagining the life they would build together. But fairy tales, as Sarah would learn, often have darker origins than most people remember. The first crack in her perfect world appeared on a Tuesday morning in March. Sarah was reviewing patient charts when her friend and fellow nurse, Maya Rodriguez, approached her station with an expression Sarah had never seen before. Maya, who had worked at St. Mary's for 12 years and had seen everything from miracle births to tragic losses, looked genuinely shaken. "Sarah, honey, we need to talk," Maya said, glancing around the busy nurses' station. Privately. They found an empty conference room, and Maya closed the door behind them. "I need to show you something, but I want you to know that I debated for weeks whether or not to tell you." Maya pulled out her phone and opened her photo gallery. The image she showed Sarah would be burned into her memory forever. It was James, unmistakably James, coming out of the Ritz-Carlton downtown. But he wasn't alone. His arm was wrapped around a petite blonde woman in designer clothing, and he was kissing her forehead in a gesture so tender, so intimate, that it made Sarah's stomach lurch. "There's more," Maya said softly, swiping to the next photo. This one showed James and the woman getting into his BMW, the same BMW that Sarah had helped him pick out for his birthday last year. The timestamp showed it was taken 3 days earlier, at 2:30 in the afternoon. Sarah knew exactly where James had told her he was at that time. In surgery. "Who is she?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Maya hesitated. "Her name is Victoria Lawson. She's an attorney at Morrison, Blake and Associates. The firm that handles the hospital's legal affairs." The room seemed to tilt. Sarah gripped the edge of the conference table, her nursing training kicking in as she recognized the signs of shock in her own body. Rapid heartbeat, shallow breathing, cold sweats. She forced herself to breathe deeply, to think rationally. "How long have you known?" she asked. "I first saw them together about 6 weeks ago. I kept telling myself it was probably innocent, maybe just a work meeting. But then I saw them again last week, and the way he looked at her." Maya's voice trailed off. "Sarah, I'm so sorry." That night, Sarah sat in her car outside her own house for 20 minutes, staring at the warm light spilling from the windows. She could see James moving around in the kitchen, probably making his famous pasta arrabbiata. For a moment, she considered pretending she'd never seen the photos. Maybe if she just tried harder, loved him more, the other woman would disappear. But Sarah Collins had never been the type to run from difficult truths. She found James exactly where she expected him, stirring sauce at the stove while jazz played softly from the Bluetooth speaker on the counter. He looked up when she entered, his face lighting up with the smile that had made her fall in love with him 7 years earlier. "There's my beautiful wife," he said, moving to kiss her cheek. "How was your day?" "Enlightening," Sarah replied, setting her purse on the kitchen island. "James, we need to talk." Something in her tone made him pause, the wooden spoon still in his hand. "Is everything okay?" Sarah pulled out her phone and showed him the photos. She watched his face carefully, noting the moment recognition hit, the way his jaw tightened, the split second of panic before his expression went carefully neutral. "Where did you get these?" he asked, his voice steady but cold. "That's your first question." "Not, I can explain, or, it's not what it looks like." James set down the spoon and turned off the burner. When he looked at her again, the warmth was gone from his eyes. "Okay, yes, I've been seeing Victoria. But Sarah, you have to understand, our marriage has been over for months. We're like roommates, not lovers." The casual cruelty of his words hit her like a physical blow. "Our marriage has been over. When exactly did you decide that? And why wasn't I informed? Come on, Sarah. When's the last time we really talked about anything other than work or the house? When's the last time we made love without it feeling like an obligation?" She stared at him, this man she thought she knew, wondering when he had become a stranger. "So instead of talking to me about it, you decided to have an affair with the hospital's attorney." "It's not just an affair," James said, and there was something in his voice that made Sarah's blood run cold. "I love her." The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Sarah felt something break inside her chest, not her heart exactly, but something deeper. Her faith in the fundamental goodness of the world. "Get out," she said quietly. "Sarah, let's be adults about this. We can work out the details of the divorce amicably. You can keep the house, and I'll make sure you're taken care of financially." I said get out. James had the audacity to look hurt. I thought you'd handle this better. You're usually so reasonable. Sarah walked to the kitchen drawer and pulled out the largest knife she could find. Not because she intended to use it, but because she needed James to understand that this conversation was over. Get out. Now. He left that night with a suitcase and a wounded expression, as if he were the victim in this scenario. Sarah stood at the kitchen window and watched him drive away, then methodically put away the ingredients for dinner that would never be cooked. The divorce proceedings were a masterclass in humiliation. Victoria Lawson, it turned out, was not just any attorney. She was the daughter of Senator Richard Lawson and one of the most ruthless divorce lawyers in the state. Somehow, she managed to represent herself in the proceedings while simultaneously being the reason for them, a conflict of interest so blatant that Sarah's attorney filed multiple objections. All of which were overruled by Judge Harrison Blackwood, who happened to be Senator Lawson's golf partner. What would you do in this situation? Tell us in the comments below. Sarah watched in stunned disbelief as her perfect life was systematically dismantled. The house she had lovingly decorated was sold, with James and Victoria getting 70% of the proceeds. Her savings account was frozen pending investigation of potential financial irregularities that never materialized. Even Buster, their golden retriever, was awarded to James because he could prove he had paid for the dog's initial veterinary bills. The final blow came when Victoria, now openly living with James, had Sarah's work schedule changed to include every holiday and weekend for the next 6 months. As the hospital's legal counsel, Victoria had that authority, and she used it with surgical precision. It's nothing personal, Victoria told Sarah during one of their forced encounters in the hospital corridor. But James needs stability right now as he adjusts to his new life. Seeing you every day at work has been difficult for him. Sarah bit back the response that James seemed to be adjusting just fine, judging by the photos of him and Victoria at various charity galas and medical conferences that kept appearing in the society pages. Instead, she simply nodded and walked away, adding this humiliation to the growing list of wrongs that needed to be righted. But the universe wasn't done with Sarah Collins yet. 2 months after the divorce was finalized, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. Not with James's child, but with the child of Michael Mitchell, James's younger brother who had offered her a shoulder to cry on during the darkest days of the divorce proceedings. Michael was everything James wasn't. Where James was calculating, Michael was spontaneous. Where James was cold, Michael was warm. And where James had abandoned her when she needed him most, Michael had held her while she cried and promised her that she deserved better. Their relationship had started innocently enough. Michael, a high school history teacher and coach, had always been the black sheep of the Mitchell family. While James pursued prestige and wealth, Michael chose a profession that paid little but meant everything to him. He had been the one to call Sarah after the divorce papers were served, the one to help her move into her small apartment, the one to listen without judgment as she poured out her heart. One night, when the loneliness felt overwhelming and the future seemed impossibly bleak, comfort had turned into something more. Sarah hadn't planned it, and she certainly hadn't planned to get pregnant, but there she was, standing in her tiny bathroom at 6 in the morning, staring at 2 pink lines. Michael's reaction had been everything she could have hoped for. No anger, no blame, just pure joy and an immediate proposal that she turned down because she refused to be the reason 2 brothers became enemies. "I need time to figure this out," she had told him. "I need to know I can do this on my own before I accept help from anyone." Michael respected her decision, but he made it clear that he would be there for her and the baby whenever she was ready. He had even started looking at larger apartments, just in case. But fate had other plans. Sarah was 7 months pregnant when she received the phone call that would change everything. It was from Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the chief of staff at St. Mary's Hospital. "Sarah, I need to see you in my office immediately. There's been an allegation made against you, and we need to discuss it." The allegation, as it turned out, was that Sarah had been stealing medication from the hospital pharmacy. Specifically, high-grade painkillers that had significant street value. The accusation came from an anonymous tip, but the evidence seemed damning. Inventory records showed discrepancies that coincided with Sarah's shifts, and a locker search had revealed a small quantity of pills hidden in her personal belongings. Sarah knew immediately that she was being framed, but proving it was another matter entirely. The hospital's security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned during the times when the thefts allegedly occurred, and the witness statements painted a picture of a desperate woman struggling financially after her divorce. Victoria Lawson, now representing the hospital in the matter, was particularly thorough in her character assassination. Mrs. Collins has shown a pattern of erratic behavior since her divorce, Victoria told the disciplinary board. Multiple witnesses have reported her appearing distressed, crying at work, and making comments about her financial difficulties. Given her current situation, it's not unreasonable to believe that she might have felt driven to desperate measures. Sarah sat through the hearing feeling like she was watching someone else's life implode. The evidence was circumstantial at best, but it was presented with such authority that even she began to doubt herself. Had she taken something and forgotten? Had the stress of the pregnancy and the divorce affected her memory? But then Maya Rodriguez took the stand. "I've worked with Sarah Collins for over 5 years," Maya said, looking directly at the board members. "She is the most ethical, compassionate nurse I've ever known. She once stayed 3 hours past her shift to comfort a grieving family, refusing overtime pay because she said it felt wrong to profit from someone else's sorrow. The idea that she would steal medication is not just unlikely, it's impossible." Other nurses came forward with similar testimonies, but it didn't matter. The board had already made up their minds. Sarah was terminated immediately, and criminal charges were filed. With a baby due in 2 months and no source of income, Sarah felt like she was drowning. That's when she met Eleanor Murphy. Eleanor was 83 years old, sharp as a tack, and had been a patient of Sarah's during a brief hospitalization for pneumonia 6 months earlier. She had taken a liking to Sarah's gentle bedside manner and had specifically requested her care during follow-up visits. When Eleanor heard about Sarah's situation through the hospital grapevine, she showed up at Sarah's apartment unannounced with a pot of soup and a job offer. "I need a private nurse," Eleanor said, settling into Sarah's only comfortable chair with the authority of someone used to getting her way. "Someone to help with my medications, drive me to appointments, and keep me company. The pay is better than the hospital, the hours are flexible, and most importantly, I don't give a damn about gossip and accusations." Eleanor Murphy, as Sarah would learn, was not just any retired widow. She was the former head librarian at the city's main branch, a position she had held for 37 years. But more importantly, she was an information detective with a network of former colleagues and friends throughout the city who owed her favors. 40 years of helping people find what they're looking for teaches you a thing or two about finding what they're trying to hide, Eleanor told Sarah with a wink. Can you guess what happens next? Drop your predictions below. Within a week of starting work for Eleanor, Sarah began to understand that her new employer was conducting her own investigation into the hospital theft charges. Eleanor had contacts everywhere: retired police officers, former court clerks, hospital employees who had worked at St. Mary's for decades. "The thing about framed jobs," Eleanor explained as she sorted through a stack of documents at her kitchen table, "is that they require accomplices. And accomplices always leave trails." Eleanor's investigation revealed several interesting facts. First, the inventory discrepancies had started 3 months before Sarah was accused, but the early shortages had been attributed to clerical errors. Second, the locker where the pills were found had been accessed by someone with an administrative key card just 2 hours before Sarah's shift ended on the day of the search. Third, and most damning, Victoria Lawson had made several visits to the hospital pharmacy in the weeks leading up to Sarah's accusation, ostensibly to review insurance protocols. "She's been planning this for months," Eleanor said, spreading photographs across the table like a detective building a case. But she made one crucial mistake. She underestimated how much people love you, and how much they despise her. Eleanor had befriended Gladys Washington, a cleaning lady who had worked at St. Mary's for 28 years and who saw everything but was noticed by almost no one. Gladys had been present when Victoria made her pharmacy visits, and she had overheard some very interesting conversations. She was asking about inventory procedures, security protocols, shift schedules. Gladys told Eleanor and Sarah during a clandestine meeting at a diner across town. But here's the thing that struck me as odd. She was asking specifically about your schedule, Sarah. Not general procedures, but when you worked, where you went, what you had access to. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes bright with the thrill of the hunt. Did she ever interact with the pharmacy staff directly? Oh yes, Gladys nodded. She was particularly friendly with Tommy Chen, the night pharmacist. Real friendly, if you know what I mean. I saw them having coffee together several times, and once I walked in on them in his office and they stopped talking real sudden-like. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Tommy Chen was a quiet man in his early 30s who had started working at the hospital around the same time the inventory discrepancies began. He had access to all the medications, knowledge of the security systems, and a gambling problem that had been the subject of staff gossip for months. "We need proof," Sarah said. "Suspicions aren't enough." Eleanor smiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. "My dear," Eleanor said, "I've been collecting proof for weeks. The question isn't whether we can prove Victoria orchestrated this frame job. The question is how public we want to make her downfall." Eleanor's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of going to the police or the hospital administration, both of which could be influenced by the Lawson family's political connections, she decided to set a trap that would force Victoria to incriminate herself. The trap involved Tommy Chen, whose gambling debts had reached critical levels. Eleanor, through her network of retired city employees, had discovered that Tommy owed over $50,000 to some very unsavory people. People who were growing impatient for repayment. "Desperation makes people do stupid things," Eleanor explained as she outlined her plan. "And desperate people make excellent witnesses when given the right motivation." Eleanor arranged for Sarah to accidentally run into Tommy at a coffee shop near the hospital. The encounter appeared spontaneous, but it was carefully orchestrated. Sarah, now 8 months pregnant and visibly struggling, played the role of the fallen nurse perfectly. "Tommy," she said, approaching his table with a mixture of surprise and exhaustion, "I didn't expect to see you here." Tommy looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting around the coffee shop as if expecting Victoria to materialize from behind a potted plant. "Sarah, how are you doing?" "Honestly? Not great. The legal bills are crushing me, and with the baby coming." She let her voice trail off, one hand resting on her swollen belly. "I keep wondering who would want to destroy my life like this." Tommy's face went pale. "Sarah, It's okay," Sarah interrupted, her voice gentle but sad. "I know you're not responsible for what happened. But sometimes I wonder if whoever did this realizes they're not just destroying me. They're hurting an innocent baby too." It was emotional manipulation, pure and simple, but it worked. Tommy's resolve crumbled like a sandcastle in a hurricane. "Meet me at Fletcher Park tomorrow at noon," he said quietly. "Come alone, and bring a recording device." The next day, Sarah sat on a park bench with Eleanor's digital recorder hidden in her jacket pocket while Tommy Chen poured out his confession like water through a broken dam. Victoria had approached him 6 months earlier, shortly after her relationship with James became public. She had done her research and knew about Tommy's gambling debts, his fear of losing his job, his desperate need for money. "She offered me $25,000 to help frame you," Tommy said, his voice shaking. "She said it would be easy, that no one would get seriously hurt, that you'd just lose your job and move on with your life. But I could have gone to prison," Sarah pointed out. I know, and I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry. She said her connections would make sure that didn't happen, that it would just be termination and maybe some community service. Tommy described the elaborate scheme in detail. Victoria had used her access to hospital records to identify the best times to steal medication, then coached Tommy on how to alter the inventory records to make it appear as though the thefts coincided with Sarah's shifts. She had provided him with an administrative key card to access Sarah's locker and plant the evidence. Where did she get the key card? Sarah asked. From Judge Blackwood's wife. She works in hospital administration, and Victoria told her it was for some legal review she was conducting. The web of corruption was wider than Sarah had imagined, involving not just Victoria and Tommy, but potentially extending to the very judge who had overseen her divorce proceedings. But then something incredible happened that would change everything. As Tommy was finishing his confession, Sarah felt a sharp pain in her lower back, followed by a warm gush of fluid. Her water had broken, and she was going into labor 8 weeks early. Oh God, she gasped, gripping the park bench. The baby's coming. Tommy, despite his guilt and fear, immediately called 911 and stayed with Sarah until the paramedics arrived. As they loaded her into the ambulance, he pressed a USB drive into her hand. Everything Victoria gave me, every email, every text message, every payment record, he said. I kept copies of everything because I was scared she'd try to blame me if things went wrong. The ambulance ride to St. Mary's Hospital was a blur of pain and panic. Sarah's contractions were coming fast and hard, and the paramedics were struggling to stabilize her blood pressure. The early labor, combined with the stress of the past months, had triggered complications that put both her and the baby at serious risk. When they arrived at the hospital, Sarah learned that Dr. Patterson, the obstetrician who had been caring for her throughout the pregnancy, was dealing with his own family emergency. His father had suffered a heart attack and was in critical condition at a hospital across town. The only doctor available to deliver her baby was Dr. James Mitchell. The universe, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor. James entered the delivery room with the same professional demeanor he brought to all his medical procedures, but Sarah could see the shock in his eyes when he realized who his patient was. The tension in the room was palpable as nurses scurried around, preparing for what was clearly going to be a difficult delivery. Sarah, James said, his voice carefully controlled, the baby is in breech position, and your blood pressure is dangerously high. We need to perform an emergency cesarean section. Sarah gripped the bed rails, another contraction tearing through her body. I don't want you touching me, she gasped. I understand your feelings, but right now, I'm not your ex-husband. I'm the only doctor here who can safely deliver your baby. You need to let me help you. Maya Rodriguez, who had rushed to the hospital when she heard about Sarah's emergency admission, stepped forward. Sarah, honey, I know this is the last thing you want, but James is a good doctor. Whatever happened between you two personally, he won't let anything happen to you or the baby. Sarah looked at Maya, then at James, then down at her swollen belly where her child was fighting for life. The baby who would never know their father because Michael had died in a car accident 3 weeks earlier, killed by a drunk driver on his way home from a parent-teacher conference. Okay, she whispered. But Maya stays in the room. Of course, James nodded, already scrubbing in for surgery. As the anesthesia took effect, Sarah found herself thinking about the recording device still hidden in her jacket pocket, about Tommy Chen's confession, about Eleanor Murphy waiting for news at home, about the evidence that would finally prove her innocence. She thought about Michael, who should have been here holding her hand, and about the baby who deserved a chance at life despite the circumstances of their conception. But mostly, she thought about how strange it was that James, who had destroyed her life so completely, was now the person responsible for saving it. The surgery went smoothly, despite the complications. James worked with the focused precision that had made him one of the top surgeons in the state, and when he lifted the tiny, perfect baby from Sarah's womb, there were tears in his eyes. It's a girl, he announced, his voice thick with emotion. She's small but strong. As the nurses cleaned and assessed the baby, James continued working to ensure Sarah's safety. It was during this process that he noticed something that made him pause. "Sarah," he said quietly, "when did you say this baby was conceived?" Sarah, still groggy from the anesthesia, looked at him with confusion. "Why does that matter? The baby's development suggests she's not as premature as we thought. Based on her size and organ maturity, I'd estimate she's closer to 36 weeks, not 32. The implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. If the baby was 36 weeks along, then she had been conceived before the divorce was finalized. Which meant that when James had been painting her as an erratic, desperate woman driven to theft by her circumstances, she had actually been pregnant with his brother's child. James seemed to realize this at the same time. His movements became mechanical as he finished the procedure, and when he looked at Sarah again, there was something different in his expression. Something that looked almost like regret. "Sarah, I..." "Don't," she interrupted. "Just don't." But James wasn't finished. "The baby's blood type is O negative. Combined with the timing." He paused, clearly struggling with something. "Michael was O negative too." It was a statement, not a question, and Sarah realized that James had figured out who the father was. More than that, she realized he was telling her that he knew the timeline of her pregnancy proved she hadn't been the desperate, erratic woman Victoria had portrayed during the theft investigation. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. James was quiet for a long moment, focusing on his post-surgical procedures. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I think I made a terrible mistake. About everything." Before Sarah could respond, the door to the operating room burst open. Victoria Lawson strode in, her designer heels clicking against the tile floor, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. "James, we need to talk. Now." "I'm in the middle of surgery," James replied, not looking up from his work. "The surgery is over. Your patient is stable. And we have a problem." Victoria's presence in the operating room was so inappropriate, so unprofessional, that several nurses exchanged shocked glances. Maya Rodriguez stepped forward, clearly intending to escort Victoria out, but Victoria held up a hand. "Tommy Chen is dead," Victoria announced, her words falling into the room like stones into still water. Sarah felt her heart stop. "What?" "Car accident about an hour ago. Single vehicle collision on the interstate. Apparently, he lost control and hit a guardrail." Victoria's eyes were cold as she looked at Sarah. "Such a tragedy. He was so distraught about his gambling debts, people are saying it might have been suicide." The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of monitoring equipment. Sarah stared at Victoria, understanding perfectly the message being conveyed. Tommy Chen had been silenced, permanently, and any evidence he might have provided had died with him. Or so Victoria thought. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her jacket pocket, where the USB drive Tommy had given her was still safely hidden. But she kept her expression neutral, refusing to give Victoria the satisfaction of seeing her panic. "That is tragic," Sarah said carefully. "He seemed like a troubled young man." Victoria studied Sarah's face for any sign of recognition or fear, but Sarah had learned a thing or two about poker faces during her months of legal battles. "Yes, well, these things happen when people get involved in situations beyond their control," Victoria said, her meaning clear. "I hope you're feeling better, Sarah. Childbirth can be so complicated." With that veiled threat hanging in the air, Victoria turned and left the operating room, her heels clicking like a countdown timer. James stared after her, and when he looked back at Sarah, she could see questions forming in his eyes. Questions about timing, about coincidences, about the woman he thought he knew. "James," Sarah said quietly, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." He nodded, still processing what had just happened. "Did Victoria know I was in labor when she came to the hospital tonight?" James frowned. "No, how could she? I didn't even know until I was called in to cover for Dr. Patterson." "Then why was she here?" The question hung between them like a challenge. James's frown deepened as he considered the implications. "She said she was here to review some legal documents with the night administrator. Something about insurance protocols." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Victoria had been at the hospital, conducting mysterious legal business, on the same night that Tommy Chin died in a convenient accident. The coincidence was too perfect, too neat. "James," Sarah said, her voice urgent despite her exhaustion, "I think you need to know something about the woman you're planning to marry." Over the next hour, as Sarah recovered from surgery and bonded with her tiny daughter, she told James everything. About Eleanor Murphy's investigation, about Tommy Chen's confession, about the USB drive hidden in her pocket containing months of incriminating evidence. James listened in stunned silence as the woman he had betrayed and abandoned revealed the depth of corruption that had surrounded their divorce. He learned about Victoria's systematic destruction of Sarah's life, about the planted evidence and falsified records, about the web of conspirators that included judges and hospital administrators. "She told me you were stealing medication," James said finally, his voice hollow. "She showed me inventory reports, witness statements. She said you were desperate after the divorce and that you'd become a liability to the hospital. And you believed her." "I wanted to believe her," James admitted. "It was easier than admitting I'd destroyed the life of a good woman for someone who—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Someone who what, James?" "Someone who isn't who I thought she was." Sarah studied her ex-husband's face, seeing something she hadn't seen in years. Genuine remorse. But remorse, she had learned, was a luxury she couldn't afford. "What are you going to do about it?" she asked. James was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to help me prove the truth. I want Victoria to face consequences for what she's done. And I want to make sure she never has the power to destroy someone else's life. She's not just going to confess, Sarah. She's too smart for that, and she has too much to lose." "I know. That's why we need to be smarter." Eleanor Murphy arrived at the hospital at dawn, carrying a bouquet of flowers and wearing an expression of fierce determination that made her look decades younger than her 83 years. She took one look at Sarah holding her daughter and immediately began plotting Victoria Lawson's downfall. "So Tommy Chen is dead," Eleanor said without preamble. "Convenient for some people, tragic for others. Eleanor, this is my ex-husband, James. James, this is Eleanor Murphy, my employer and the closest thing I have to family right now." James extended his hand, but Eleanor ignored it, studying him with the sharp eyes of someone who had spent decades evaluating people's character through their choice of library books. "You're the surgeon who abandoned his wife for a corrupt attorney," she said matter-of-factly. "I'd say it's nice to meet you, but lying is a sin." "Mrs. Murphy." "It's Miss Murphy, thank you. I never found a man worth changing my name for." She turned back to Sarah. "Now, about our little problem. Tommy Chen's death wasn't an accident." Eleanor proceeded to lay out the evidence she had gathered during the night. Through her network of contacts, she had learned that Tommy's car had been found with its brake lines severed. The crash scene had been staged to look like a loss-of-control accident, but the preliminary investigation had revealed clear signs of sabotage. Moreover, Eleanor continued, "Tommy called me 2 hours before he died. He was terrified, said someone had been following him, threatening him. He begged me to make sure Sarah got the evidence he'd given her." James looked between the two women, clearly struggling to process the implications. "You're talking about murder." "I'm talking about silencing a witness," Eleanor corrected. And if Victoria Lawson is willing to kill to protect her secrets, then none of us are safe. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Victoria appeared in the doorway of Sarah's hospital room. She was perfectly dressed despite the early hour, her hair immaculate, her makeup flawless. Only her eyes betrayed the strain she was under. "James, darling, I've been looking for you everywhere. We need to discuss our wedding plans." The casual mention of wedding plans, delivered in a hospital room where Sarah was recovering from emergency surgery to deliver her dead boyfriend's child, was so callous that even James flinched. "Victoria, this isn't the time or place." "Nonsense. Life goes on, and we have a future to plan." Victoria's gaze swept the room, taking in Eleanor's protective stance beside Sarah's bed and the tiny baby sleeping in the bassinet. "Besides, I thought it might be nice to share our good news with your ex-wife. Show her that some people do get their happy endings." Eleanor stepped forward, and Sarah could practically see the retired librarian transforming into a warrior. "Speaking of happy endings, I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Eleanor Murphy, and I make it my business to help people find what they're looking for." "How lovely," Victoria replied, her tone suggesting it was anything but. "And what is it you're looking for, Miss Murphy?" "Justice," Eleanor said simply. "It's been remarkably elusive lately, but I have a feeling it's about to make an appearance." The two women stared at each other across the hospital room, and Sarah realized she was witnessing a battle between two very different kinds of power. Victoria had money, connections, and legal authority. But Eleanor had something Victoria had never possessed, the moral authority that came from a lifetime of helping people without expecting anything in return. "Well," Victoria said after a moment, "I suppose everyone needs a hobby. James, shall we go? I've made reservations at that new French place downtown." But James didn't move. Instead, he looked at Sarah, then at his daughter sleeping peacefully in her bassinet, then back at Victoria. "Actually, Victoria, I think I need to stay here for a while. There are some things I need to understand better." Victoria's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly underneath. "James, you're not seriously going to let this woman manipulate you with some sob story about her illegitimate child?" The words hung in the air like poison gas. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes, not from the physical pain radiating through her swollen belly, but from the cruel irony of fate. The man she had loved, married, and trusted with her deepest secrets now stood before her in surgical scrubs, his hands gloved and ready to deliver the child she carried, a child that wasn't his. The recognition was immediate and mutual. James looked exactly as Sarah remembered him, perfectly groomed and expensively dressed beneath his medical coat, but there was something different in his eyes. The arrogance was still there, but it was tempered by something she couldn't quite identify. Professional duty? Genuine concern? Or was it the same calculated coldness that had destroyed their marriage 3 years ago? "Sarah." His voice was steady, clinical. "I'm Dr. Morrison, and I'll be handling your delivery today. Your regular physician had an emergency, and I'm the only obstetrician available." She wanted to scream, to demand another doctor, to run from this sterile room that suddenly felt like a trap. But another contraction gripped her, doubling her over with pain that made rational thought impossible. The baby was coming whether she wanted this reunion or not. You won't believe what happened when this woman went into labor and discovered her ex-husband was the only doctor who could save her child's life. This story will restore your faith in the power of redemption, even in the most impossible circumstances. 3 years earlier, Sarah Martinez had been a different woman entirely. As head of pediatric nursing at St. Mary's Children's Hospital, she had dedicated her life to caring for the smallest, most vulnerable patients. Her colleagues respected her gentle touch with frightened children and her fierce advocacy for their well-being. But beneath her professional competence lay a deep well of insecurity, stemming from a childhood spent bouncing between foster homes after her parents died in a car crash when she was 8. "You're going to be okay, sweetheart," she would whisper to the sick children under her care, the same words she had longed to hear as a terrified little girl in an unfamiliar bed. Sarah's fear of abandonment ran so deep that she often sabotaged relationships before they could hurt her, pushing away anyone who tried to get too close. That pattern might have continued forever if she hadn't met Dr. James Morrison during his residency rotation through the pediatric ward. Tall, confident, and devastatingly handsome, James came from the kind of old-money family that Sarah had only seen in movies. The Morrisons owned half the real estate in the city's historic district, and James's trust fund could have bought the entire hospital. Nurse Martinez, he had said during their first encounter, not bothering to look up from the chart he was reviewing. I need you to prep room 304 for a lumbar puncture. It's Sarah, she had replied quietly. And I've already prepared the room. Would you like me to explain the procedure to the parents? They're quite frightened. That had made him look up. Most nurses didn't challenge him, and certainly not with such quiet confidence. I'll handle the parents, he had said, but there was curiosity in his voice now rather than dismissal. What followed was a whirlwind courtship that surprised everyone who knew them. James, who had never dated anyone outside his social circle, was enchanted by Sarah's genuine compassion and her complete indifference to his wealth. Sarah, who had spent years building walls around her heart, found herself helplessly drawn to his charm and apparent devotion. I love that you see me, not my bank account, he had whispered during one of their early dates, as they walked through the hospital garden after her shift. You're real, Sarah. Everything else in my world is fake. They married 18 months later in a small ceremony that James's family attended with barely concealed disapproval. Margaret Morrison, James's mother, had pulled Sarah aside during the reception with a smile as cold as winter steel. You seem like a lovely girl, dear, Margaret had said, adjusting Sarah's veil with fingers that felt like ice. I do hope you understand that marriage in our family comes with certain expectations. James has a brilliant career ahead of him, and he'll need a wife who can support his ambitions without creating unnecessary distractions. Sarah had nodded, not fully understanding the warning hidden in those carefully chosen words. She was too happy, too grateful for this miracle of being chosen by someone like James, to see the signs of trouble ahead. The first year of marriage had been blissful. James was attentive and romantic, bringing her flowers and surprise gifts that made her colleagues tease her about her fairy tale romance. He supported her decision to pursue her master's degree in nursing administration, even helping her study for her comprehensive exams. You're brilliant, he would say, watching her work through complex case studies at their kitchen table. I'm proud of you, Sarah. Really proud. But subtle changes began creeping into their relationship as James advanced in his career. The residency ended, and he joined Whitmore Medical Group, the most prestigious practice in the city. Suddenly, there were more dinner parties to attend, more charity galas where Sarah felt desperately out of place among women who spent more on handbags than she made in a month. Could you maybe tone down the work stories tonight? James had asked one evening as they prepared for another social function. The Whitmore partners will be there, and I need to make the right impression. Sarah had stared at herself in their bedroom mirror, smoothing the dress that had cost more than her car payment. When had taking care of sick children become something to tone down? The breaking point came during their second year of marriage, at the annual Whitmore Medical Group Gala. Sarah had spent weeks preparing, getting her hair done professionally and buying a gown that made her feel like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life. She was trying her best to make conversation with Dr. Whitmore's wife when she overheard James talking to a colleague near the bar. The wife? James's voice carried the slight slur that meant he'd had too many drinks. She's sweet, but you know how it is. I married down, thinking it would be refreshing, but there's only so much small talk about pediatric protocols a man can take. The other doctor laughed. At least she's pretty. Some of these mercy marriages don't even have that going for them. Pretty and grateful, James had agreed. Very, very grateful. It's almost too easy. Sarah had felt something die inside her chest. The carefully constructed fairy tale crumbled, revealing the ugly truth beneath. She wasn't his beloved wife, she was his charity case, his noble experiment in slumming with the working class. She had left that night without saying goodbye, driving home through tears that made the city lights blur into watercolor streaks. When James came home 3 hours later, reeking of alcohol and cheap perfume, she was sitting in their living room with divorce papers already printed from their home computer. "Sarah, sweetheart, you're being dramatic," he had said, loosening his tie with the same casual confidence that had once made her heart race. "So I had a few drinks and said some things. Big deal. You know I love you." "No," she had whispered, her voice barely audible but steady as stone. "You love the idea of me. The grateful little nurse who makes you feel generous and charitable. But you don't know the real me at all, because you've never bothered to look. What would you do in this situation? Could you forgive words that cut so deep? Tell us in the comments below." The divorce had been swift and brutal. James's family lawyers descended like vultures, contesting every asset and painting Sarah as a gold digger despite her refusal to ask for alimony. The stress cost her the promotion she had been working toward, and the whispers followed her through the hospital corridors like a toxic cloud. "Did you hear? She's divorcing James Morrison. Apparently, she thinks she's entitled to half of everything. I always wondered what he saw in her. Now we know it wasn't for love." The worst part was James himself, who seemed to view the divorce as another medical procedure to be handled with cold efficiency. He moved out of their shared condo and immediately into a penthouse apartment that cost more per month than Sarah made in a year. Within weeks, he was seen around town with Victoria Ashford, a pharmaceutical heiress whose father owned 3 companies that supplied the hospital. Sarah had tried to stay professional during the few times their paths crossed at work, but James seemed to take a perverse pleasure in making those encounters as uncomfortable as possible. He would appear at nursing stations where she was working, speaking loudly about his new relationship or his upcoming vacation to the Mediterranean with his, much more suitable, companion. "Some people just don't understand what it takes to succeed in this profession," he had said once, just loud enough for Sarah to hear as she prepared medication for a young patient. The social responsibilities, the networking requirements. It's not enough to just be adequate. The final straw came when Sarah discovered that James had been spreading rumors about her professional competence, suggesting to colleagues that her emotional instability during the divorce had affected her patient care. It was a lie, a vicious fabrication designed to destroy what remained of her reputation, but the damage was done. When the head of nursing called her into the office for a performance review, Sarah knew it was time to leave. She had taken a position at Riverside General, a smaller community hospital across town where nobody knew about her failed marriage or her humiliating fall from grace. The pay was lower, the hours longer, but it was a chance to start over without the constant reminder of her spectacular failure in judgment. That was where she had met David Chen, a kind and gentle emergency room physician who treated every patient with the same careful attention whether they were CEOs or homeless veterans. David was recently divorced himself, with joint custody of his 8-year-old daughter Emma, and he understood the complexity of building trust after betrayal. "I don't need you to be perfect," David had told her during one of their early conversations over coffee in the hospital cafeteria. "I just need you to be honest. We've both been hurt, and we both have baggage. Maybe we can figure it out together." Their relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than the intoxicating rush of Sarah's marriage to James. David encouraged her career ambitions, celebrating when she was promoted to charge nurse and supporting her decision to specialize in emergency pediatrics. When Sarah discovered she was pregnant 8 months into their relationship, David's reaction was everything James's might have been if their marriage had been real. "Are you happy?" he had asked, holding her hands as she showed him the positive pregnancy test. "Because if you're happy, then I'm over the moon. Emma's going to love being a big sister." They had planned to marry before the baby was born, but David's sudden deployment with the Army Reserve Medical Corps to provide humanitarian aid in a disaster zone had delayed their wedding. He had been gone for 2 months, and Sarah was managing her high-risk pregnancy alone when the complications began. Preeclampsia had forced her onto bed rest for the final month of her pregnancy, and when she went into labor 3 weeks early, her regular obstetrician was dealing with his own family emergency. The cruel irony of fate had delivered her into the hands of the one man who had promised to love, honor, and cherish her, only to discard her like yesterday's newspaper. Now, as another contraction gripped her with overwhelming intensity, Sarah found herself completely at the mercy of the man who had once held her heart in his hands and crushed it without a second thought. "The baby's in distress," James said, his voice taking on the professional urgency she remembered from their early days when he actually cared about his patients. "Sarah, I know this is complicated. But I need you to trust me right now. Your baby's life depends on it. Trust." The word hung between them like a challenge, loaded with years of pain and betrayal. But as Sarah felt the baby's movements become weaker, she realized that her feelings about James Morrison were irrelevant. This was about her child, David's child, the future they had planned together. "Do whatever you have to do," she whispered, closing her eyes against the fluorescent lights and the memories they illuminated. "Just save my baby." What Sarah didn't know was that James had been carrying his own burden of guilt and regret since their divorce. The confident, arrogant man who had dismissed her so cruelly had been living a lie, one that was about to be exposed in the most dramatic way possible. As James began the emergency procedures that might save both Sarah and her baby, neither of them realized that this forced reunion would reveal secrets that would change everything they thought they knew about their marriage, their divorce, and the real reason behind James's cruel betrayal. Can you guess what happens next? Drop your predictions below. The delivery room filled with controlled chaos as James called for additional staff. Nurse Patricia Williams, a 30-year veteran who had assisted in thousands of births, appeared at his shoulder with the efficiency of someone who had seen every possible complication. "Doctor, the baby's heart rate is dropping rapidly," Patricia announced, her eyes fixed on the fetal monitor. "We're looking at severe bradycardia." James's hands moved with practiced precision, but Sarah could see something in his expression that hadn't been there during their marriage, genuine fear. Not the calculated concern of a physician going through the motions, but raw, human terror at the possibility of losing a patient. "Sarah, I need to perform an emergency cesarean section," he explained, his voice steady despite the sweat beading on his forehead. "The baby isn't getting enough oxygen, and we can't wait for a natural delivery." Through her pain and fear, Sarah managed to nod her consent. As the anesthesiologist prepared her epidural, she caught James's eye in a moment of startling vulnerability. "I won't let anything happen to your child," he said quietly, and for the first time in 3 years, she heard the man she had fallen in love with rather than the cruel stranger he had become. The surgery was a testament to James's skill as a physician. Despite their personal history, he worked with the focus and dedication that had made him one of the most respected obstetricians in the city. Sarah watched his reflection in the surgical light above her, seeing the intense concentration she remembered from their early days together when he would study for hours, determined to be the best doctor he could be. "It's a girl," James announced as he lifted the baby from Sarah's womb. The tiny infant was blue and unnaturally quiet, sending a spike of terror through Sarah's already racing heart. "Why isn't she crying?" Sarah asked, trying to lift her head to see her daughter. Nurse Patricia was already working with the neonatal team, suctioning fluid from the baby's lungs and administering oxygen. The seconds stretched into an eternity as everyone in the room held their breath, waiting for the sound that would mean the difference between joy and heartbreak. Then it came, a weak but unmistakable cry that filled the delivery room with relieved laughter and tears. Sarah felt her own tears streaming down her face as James placed the baby on her chest, still connected by the umbilical cord that had sustained her for 9 months. "She's beautiful," James said softly, and something in his voice made Sarah look at him with surprise. There was genuine emotion there, not the professional detachment she had expected. Absolutely beautiful. As the medical team completed the delivery and began Sarah's recovery, James surprised everyone by staying beyond what was medically necessary. He filled out paperwork, checked on the baby's vital signs, and even held little Grace, the name Sarah had chosen months ago, while the nurses prepared her bassinet. "You did great," he told Sarah as the medical team began to disperse. "Both of you are healthy, which is what matters most." Sarah studied his face, looking for traces of the cruelty she remembered. "James, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." He nodded, settling into the chair beside her bed with an expression that was surprisingly open. "Why did you really divorce me?" she asked. "And don't give me that speech about incompatibility or different social circles. I heard what you said at that party, but there was something else, wasn't there? Something you never told me." James was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I was dying," he said simply. Sarah felt her blood run cold. "What?" "I was diagnosed with a rare genetic condition during our second year of marriage. The doctors gave me 2 years to live, maybe 3 if I was lucky. The symptoms hadn't started yet, but the blood tests were definitive." The words hung in the air between them like a confession that changed everything. Sarah felt her carefully constructed narrative of betrayal and abandonment crumbling as she tried to process this revelation. "You divorced me because you were sick?" she asked, her voice sharp with disbelief and growing anger. "You let me believe that I wasn't good enough, that you were embarrassed by me, when you were actually trying to protect me from watching you die." James ran his hands through his hair, a gesture she remembered from their most difficult conversations during their marriage. "I thought it would be easier for you. A clean break, a chance to find someone who could give you the life you deserved. Someone healthy who could give you children and grow old with you. That wasn't your choice to make." Sarah's voice rose, causing baby Grace to stir in her arms. "You took away my right to decide what I could handle, what I wanted to fight for. You made me believe I was worthless instead of telling me the truth." "I know," James admitted, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I know I handled it wrong. I was 28 years old and terrified, and I thought I was being noble. Instead, I was just a coward who couldn't bear to watch you watch me die." Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions washing over her, anger at his deception, grief for the time they had lost, and a crushing sadness for the fear he must have carried alone. "What happened? Are you?" "I'm in remission," James said. "The experimental treatment I started 18 months ago has been incredibly effective. My latest tests show no sign of the disease progression. I might live a normal lifespan after all. Sometimes the most incredible twists come not from external forces, but from the lies we tell ourselves to avoid facing the truth." But then something incredible happened that would reveal the full extent of the deception. As Sarah struggled to absorb this information, Nurse Patricia returned to check on her recovery. But instead of the routine post-delivery examination Sarah expected, Patricia's expression was troubled. "Dr. Morrison," Patricia said carefully, "there's something you need to see. We've been trying to reach Dr. Chen to inform him about the birth, but there's been a development." James frowned. "What kind of development?" Patricia hesitated, glancing between Sarah and James. "Perhaps we should speak privately." "No," Sarah said firmly. "Whatever it is, I can hear it. David is my fiancé and this baby's father. If something's happened to him..." Patricia nodded reluctantly. "We received word from the Army Reserve Medical Command. Dr. Chen's unit was involved in an incident overseas. He's been listed as missing in action for the past 72 hours. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. David, who had been so excited about becoming a father, who had kissed her goodbye with promises to return in time for the birth, might never meet his daughter. "Missing doesn't mean dead," James said quietly, and Sarah was surprised by the gentle compassion in his voice. Military communications can be unreliable in disaster zones. He could be helping patients in a remote area with no way to contact the outside world. Sarah clutched Grace closer, feeling the weight of suddenly being responsible for this tiny life without the partner she had counted on. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent 3 years rebuilding her life after James's betrayal, only to find herself facing potential abandonment again, this time through no one's fault. "There's more," Patricia continued reluctantly. "The hospital administration needs to discuss some matters with you regarding your insurance coverage and Dr. Chen's military benefits. Given the uncertainty of his status." "She doesn't need to worry about that right now," James interrupted with surprising firmness. "Whatever the costs are for Sarah and the baby's care, send the bills to me. Dr. Chen is serving his country, and his family shouldn't have to deal with bureaucratic nonsense while he's missing." Sarah stared at him in shock. This was not the James Morrison she had divorced, the man who had calculated the cost of every kindness and found her wanting. This was someone she didn't recognize, someone who seemed genuinely committed to doing the right thing without expecting anything in return. Over the following days, as Sarah recovered from her cesarean section and learned to care for Grace, James continued to surprise her. He checked on them twice daily, far more than any other physician would have done. He brought practical gifts, high-quality diapers, a breast pump, books about infant development, rather than the flashy displays she might have expected. More importantly, he seemed genuinely interested in Grace as a person rather than just a medical case. He would hold her during his visits, talking to her in the soft voice Sarah remembered him using with his youngest patients during his residency. "She has your stubborn streak," he told Sarah one afternoon as Grace fussed during a feeding. "Look at that determined little frown. She knows what she wants. How can you tell she's stubborn?" Sarah asked, adjusting Grace's position. "She's only 4 days old." James smiled, and for a moment Sarah glimpsed the man she had fallen in love with years ago. "She's been fighting since the moment she was born. Came into this world ready to take on whatever challenges were waiting for her. That's definitely something she got from her mother." The comment was so different from the cutting remarks he had made during their divorce that Sarah found herself studying his face for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda. But she saw only genuine warmth and what looked suspiciously like regret. It was Dr. Elizabeth Harper, Sarah's former colleague from St. Mary's, who finally provided the missing piece of the puzzle. Elizabeth had been one of the few people who remained neutral during Sarah's divorce, maintaining friendships with both parties despite the hospital gossip. "You know, I never told you this," Elizabeth said during a visit to see the baby. "But James came to see me about 6 months after your divorce was finalized. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in weeks. He wanted to know how you were doing, if you were happy." Sarah felt her breath catch. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That you were struggling but surviving. That you'd taken the job at Riverside General and were slowly rebuilding your confidence. He asked me not to tell you about the conversation." Elizabeth paused, settling more comfortably in the hospital room chair. "He also asked me to keep an eye on your career, to let him know if you ever needed anything. When you applied for that emergency pediatric certification program last year, the one that was so competitive. I remember. I was shocked when I got accepted. James made a donation to the program. A substantial one. He never wanted you to know, but I thought you should understand that he never stopped caring about your success." Sarah felt the room spinning slightly as another piece of her carefully constructed understanding of the past 3 years shifted. "He's been helping me this whole time. I think he's been trying to make amends in the only way he knew how," Elizabeth said gently. "Without interfering in your life directly or making you feel beholden to him." That evening, as Sarah fed Grace while watching the sunset through her hospital room window, James made his usual visit. But instead of the brief medical check she expected, he lingered, seeming to struggle with something he wanted to say. Elizabeth told me she talked to you today, he said finally. Sarah nodded. She told me about the donation. And about you checking on me. I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, James said, his voice heavy with emotion. I handled everything wrong 3 years ago. I was scared and stupid, and I hurt you in ways that can never be undone. But I need you to know that divorcing you was the hardest thing I've ever done, and not a day has gone by that I haven't regretted how I handled it. Then why didn't you tell me the truth? Sarah asked. Why let me believe that I wasn't good enough? James was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. Because I was a coward. I knew that if I told you I was sick, you would never leave. You would have stayed and fought and sacrificed your own happiness to take care of me. I couldn't bear the thought of you watching me waste away, couldn't stand the idea of becoming your burden instead of your partner. So you decided to break my heart instead. I thought a broken heart would heal faster than a lifetime of regret, James admitted. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about everything. Little did he know, she had a plan that would change both of their lives forever. But first, the most shocking revelation was yet to come. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Major Patricia Reynolds, the Army Reserve Liaison Officer, arrived at the hospital with an update about David's status that no one could have anticipated. Dr. Chen has been found, Major Reynolds announced, but her expression remained grave. However, his injuries are extensive. He's been transferred to a military medical facility in Germany for emergency surgery. Sarah felt her heart drop. How extensive? Multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and a severe traumatic brain injury. The medical team is optimistic about his physical recovery, but there may be lasting cognitive effects. It's too early to know the extent of any permanent damage. The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. David, who had been so excited about becoming a father, might never be the same person who had kissed her goodbye 2 months ago. The man who had promised to love both her and Grace might return as someone entirely different, if he returned at all. When can I see him? Sarah asked, though she knew the answer would be complicated. He'll remain in Germany for at least 6 weeks while he undergoes multiple surgeries and begins rehabilitation. After that, if his condition stabilizes, he'll be transferred to Walter Reed Medical Center for continued treatment. As Major Reynolds left, Sarah found herself alone with Grace and a future that had become impossibly uncertain. She was a single mother with a newborn, facing the possibility that the man she loved might never recover enough to be the father he had dreamed of becoming. It was James who found her crying in the hospital chapel that afternoon, Grace sleeping peacefully in her carrier beside the pew where Sarah knelt in desperate prayer. I heard about David, he said softly, sliding into the pew beside her. I'm sorry, Sarah. I know how much you love him. I don't know what I'm going to do, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. How do I raise her alone? How do I hope that he'll recover while preparing for the possibility that he won't? How do I even begin to make sense of any of this? James was quiet for several minutes, and Sarah thought he might leave her to grieve in private. Instead, he surprised her by speaking with more vulnerability than she had ever heard from him. When I was diagnosed with that genetic condition, I spent months planning how to end our marriage in a way that would hurt you the least. I researched divorce lawyers, calculated financial settlements, even practiced the speech I would give you about growing apart. But you know what I never did? Sarah looked at him through her tears. I never asked you what you wanted. I never gave you the choice to fight alongside me or to make your own decision about what you could handle. I took away your agency because I thought I knew better than you did what was best for your life. What are you saying? I'm saying that whatever decisions you need to make about David, about Grace, about your future, those are your choices to make. Not mine, not the Army's, not anyone else's. You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for, and you're certainly stronger than I was when I faced my own crisis. James paused, seeming to gather courage for what he wanted to say next. But I also want you to know that you don't have to face this alone. Not financially, not practically, not emotionally. Whatever you need, whatever Grace needs, I'm here. Sarah studied his face, looking for the ulterior motive she had learned to expect from him. Why? What could you possibly gain from helping me? Nothing, James said simply. Absolutely nothing except maybe the chance to be the man I should have been 3 years ago. The man who would have deserved someone like you. Over the following weeks, as Sarah adjusted to life as a new mother while waiting for news about David's condition, James proved true to his word. He helped her navigate the complex paperwork required to access David's military benefits, connected her with support groups for families of injured veterans, and even arranged for a colleague to provide follow-up pediatric care for Grace at no cost. More surprisingly, he began spending time with them not as a doctor, but as what could only be described as a friend. He would stop by Sarah's apartment after his shifts, bringing dinner from restaurants that accommodated her dietary restrictions while nursing, and would hold Grace while Sarah showered or napped. You don't have to do this, Sarah told him one evening as he assembled a crib that had been delivered that afternoon. You've already done more than enough. I know I don't have to, James replied, tightening a bolt with more force than necessary. I want to. For the first time in years, I'm doing something because it's right, not because it benefits me somehow. Sarah watched him work, noting the careful attention he paid to the assembly instructions, the way he double-checked every connection to ensure Grace's safety. This was not the careless, entitled man she had divorced. This was someone who had learned the value of putting others' needs before his own desires. The revelation that would change everything came 3 weeks later, delivered in the form of a phone call that Sarah almost didn't answer. Mrs. Martinez? The voice was unfamiliar, professional. This is Jennifer Walsh from Walsh, Martinez, and Associates. I'm calling about your ex-husband's medical condition and some irregularities we've discovered in your divorce settlement. Sarah felt her blood run cold. Irregularities? I'm afraid I need to discuss this with you in person. Would it be possible for you to come to our office tomorrow? There are some documents you need to see. The law office was in the same upscale district where James worked, all marble floors and expensive art that made Sarah feel underdressed despite her best efforts. Jennifer Walsh was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who got straight to the point. Mrs. Martinez, what I'm about to tell you may come as a shock. We've been investigating some financial discrepancies related to your divorce settlement, and we've discovered that your ex-husband provided false information to his attorneys during the proceedings. Sarah felt Grace stirring in her carrier and automatically began rocking her. What kind of false information? He claimed to be suffering from a terminal illness that would prevent him from working in the future, which significantly reduced the settlement you received. However, our investigation shows that he was actually participating in an experimental treatment program that his lawyers knew had a high success rate. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. You're saying he lied about being sick? No, Jennifer said carefully. He was indeed diagnosed with the condition he claimed. However, he failed to disclose that he was already responding well to treatment at the time of your divorce. His lawyers used the worst-case prognosis to minimize his financial obligations to you, while he was privately optimistic about his recovery. Sarah felt the room spinning as she processed this information. So he let me believe he was dying to get out of paying me what I was legally entitled to. It appears that way. Mrs. Martinez, based on his current health status and earning potential, you would be entitled to a substantially larger settlement. We're talking about a difference of several $100,000. What would you do if you discovered your ex-husband had cheated you out of your rightful divorce settlement? The answer to that question was about to surprise everyone. Sarah left the law office in a daze, Grace sleeping peacefully in her car seat as they drove through the city streets that had once felt like home but now seemed foreign and hostile. The revelation that James had not only lied about his reasons for divorcing her but had also cheated her out of financial security she desperately needed felt like a betrayal on top of a betrayal. She had been struggling to pay rent on her small apartment, carefully budgeting every penny to provide for Grace while taking unpaid maternity leave. Meanwhile, James had been living in his penthouse, driving luxury cars, and making charitable donations to her professional development while knowing he owed her hundreds of thousands of dollars. But as Sarah pulled into her apartment complex and saw James's car already in the parking lot, she felt something shift inside her. Anger, yes, but also a cold clarity that surprised her with its intensity. James was waiting by her door with takeout bags and his usual warm smile, the same expression he had worn for the past month as he helped her navigate new motherhood. But now Sarah saw it differently, not as genuine care, but as the guilt-driven performance of a man trying to assuage his conscience on the cheap. "I brought Thai food," he said cheerfully. "That green curry you like, and I got it mild since you're still nursing." "We need to talk," Sarah said, unlocking her door with hands that remained perfectly steady despite the fury building inside her. James followed her into the small living room, chattering about his day until he noticed Sarah's expression as she settled Grace in her bouncy seat. "I met with Jennifer Walsh today," Sarah said without preamble. "She had some very interesting things to tell me about our divorce settlement." The color drained from James's face so quickly that Sarah thought he might faint. He set the food down with hands that suddenly seemed unsteady and sank into the chair across from her. "Sarah, I can explain dash. Can you?" Sarah's voice was deceptively calm. "Can you explain why you let your lawyers argue that you were too sick to work while you were secretly optimistic about your recovery? Can you explain why you cheated me out of hundreds of thousands of dollars while watching me struggle to pay rent and buy groceries?" James opened his mouth to respond, but Sarah held up a hand to stop him. "Can you explain why you've been playing the role of the reformed ex-husband, bringing me dinner and helping with the baby, all while knowing you stole from me? Were you planning to tell me the truth eventually, or were you hoping I'd be so grateful for your scraps of kindness that I'd never find out?" "It wasn't like that," James said desperately. "The treatment was experimental. There was no guarantee it would work. I was terrified dash. You were terrified, so you decided to make sure that if you did recover, you'd get to keep all your money while your ex-wife scraped by on minimum wage. You were terrified, so you made certain that the consequences of your illness would fall entirely on me." James buried his face in his hands. "I know how it looks, but you have to understand the mindset I was in. I was 28 years old and facing death. I wasn't thinking clearly about the future because I didn't think I'd have one. But your lawyers were thinking clearly," Sarah pointed out with icy precision. "They knew exactly what they were doing when they used your illness to minimize your financial obligations. They knew the treatment had a good chance of success, and they chose not to disclose that because it would have cost you your medical license. They buried evidence that could have saved everything you worked for." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes, not from sadness, but from a rage so pure it felt like fire coursing through her veins. She gripped the hospital bed rails until her knuckles turned white, her body trembling as another contraction built. The recognition was immediate and mutual. James looked exactly as Sarah remembered him, perfectly groomed and expensively dressed, but there was something different in his eyes now. Fear. He knew exactly who she was, and more importantly, he knew what he had done to her 5 years ago. "Mrs. Coleman," he said, his voice professionally steady, but she caught the slight tremor. "I'm Dr. James Harrison. I'll be overseeing your delivery tonight." Sarah's laugh was bitter and sharp. "Dr. Harrison. How wonderfully ironic." Another contraction hit, and she breathed through it, never breaking eye contact with the man who had destroyed her life. "Tell me, James, do you still sleep well at night?" The nurse in the room, a kind-faced woman named Betty, looked between them with obvious confusion. "Do you two know each other?" "Oh, we have history," Sarah said, her voice dripping with venom. "Don't we, darling?" James cleared his throat, his professional mask slipping slightly. "Perhaps we should focus on the matter at hand. You're in active labor, Anne. And you're the last person on earth I want touching me or my child, Sarah spat. But here we are, aren't we? Life has such a twisted sense of humor. What would you do in this situation? Tell us in comments below. Betty stepped forward, sensing the tension. Mrs. Coleman, if you're uncomfortable, we can arrange for another doctor. No, Sarah said suddenly, a cold smile spreading across her face. No, I think Dr. Harrison is exactly the right person for this job. After all, he owes me. James's face went pale. He knew she was referring to more than just medical care. 5 years ago, Sarah had been Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a promising young surgeon with a bright future ahead of her. That was before James Harrison, then chief of surgery at Metropolitan General, had orchestrated her downfall with surgical precision. The flashback hit Sarah like a physical blow. She was back in that sterile conference room, facing a panel of stern-faced hospital administrators. James sat at the head of the table, his expression grave and disappointed. Dr. Mitchell, he had said, his voice heavy with false regret, the evidence is clear. The patient's death was a direct result of your negligence during the procedure. The family is threatening a malpractice suit that could destroy this hospital's reputation. Sarah had stood there, stunned, holding the fabricated reports that painted her as incompetent and reckless. She tried to speak, to defend herself, but James had already poisoned the well. I trusted you, she had whispered. We were supposed to be partners. Sometimes trust is misplaced, he had replied coldly. Your medical license is suspended pending full investigation. Security will escort you out. The memory faded as another contraction gripped her, bringing her back to the present. James was checking her vitals, his hands steady despite the obvious tension in his shoulders. 8 centimeters dilated, he announced to Betty. We're moving quickly now. Good, Sarah said through gritted teeth. I've waited 5 years for this moment. James looked up sharply. Sarah, whatever you think you know. I know everything, James. Every lie. Every forged document. Every bribe. Her voice was low and dangerous. Did you really think I'd just disappear? That I'd crawl away and die quietly? Betty excused herself to get more supplies, leaving them alone for the first time in 5 years. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap. The Mitchell case was investigated thoroughly, James said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. You made mistakes. Serious ones. Sarah laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night? That I actually killed Patricia Hawthorne? That those surgical notes in my handwriting were real? James's jaw tightened. You were young. Inexperienced. You panicked during the procedure, Anne. I was 20 feet away when she died, Sarah interrupted. You know that. You were the one operating. You were the one who nicked her carotid artery. You were the one who killed her, and you let me take the blame. The accusation hung between them like a blade. James's professional composure cracked slightly, revealing the guilty man underneath. You can't prove that, he said quietly. Can't I? Sarah's smile was predatory now. You'd be surprised what a determined woman can accomplish in 5 years. Especially when she has nothing left to lose. Another contraction hit, stronger this time, and Sarah gripped the bed rails again. But even through the pain, her eyes never left James's face. She was studying him, cataloging every micro-expression, every tell that revealed his growing panic. 9 centimeters, James announced after checking again. The baby's coming soon. Our timing has always been perfect, hasn't it? Sarah said. Just like that night at the hospital Christmas party, when you seduced me in your office. When you made me believe you loved me. When you convinced me to trust you with my career, my future, my heart. James glanced toward the door nervously. "Sarah, this isn't the time." "This is exactly the time," she hissed. "You destroyed my life, James. You took everything from me. My career, my reputation, my ability to practice medicine. Do you know what it's like to have your life's work stripped away because of someone else's lies?" "You found another path," he said weakly. "You became a nurse. You're helping people." "A nurse," Sarah repeated, her voice filled with bitter irony. "After 8 years of medical school, after my residency, after everything I sacrificed to become a surgeon, I'm emptying bedpans and taking orders from doctors half as talented as I ever was." The door opened and Betty returned with a cart of supplies. Behind her came Dr. Rebecca Chase, the hospital's head of obstetrics, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and keen eyes. "I heard we might need some additional support," Dr. Chase said, sizing up the situation immediately. She had the kind of intuition that came from decades of dealing with complicated births and even more complicated people. "Everything's under control," James said quickly. "Is it?" Dr. Chase looked directly at Sarah. "Mrs. Coleman, are you comfortable with your care team?" Sarah studied the older woman's face and saw something there, understanding, perhaps even recognition. "Dr. Chase, isn't it? I've heard excellent things about your work." "And I've heard some interesting things about you," Dr. Chase replied cryptically. "We can discuss them after you deliver this baby. Right now, let's focus on bringing your child safely into the world." The next contraction was the strongest yet, and Sarah felt the overwhelming urge to push. James positioned himself, his hands steady despite everything, and Sarah had to admit grudgingly that he was still an excellent doctor, even if he was a terrible human being. "On the next contraction, I need you to push," he instructed. "Gladly," Sarah said, and there was something in her tone that made James look up sharply. "I've been waiting to push back for 5 years. Can you guess what happens next? Drop your predictions below." As Sarah pushed, she thought about the folder hidden in her apartment. 5 years of meticulous investigation, of tracking down witnesses, of uncovering the truth that James thought he had buried forever. Patricia Hawthorne's family had never known the real story of their mother's death. They had accepted James's version of events, had even received a substantial settlement from the hospital to keep quiet about the surgical error. But Sarah knew the truth. She had video evidence from the hospital's security cameras that James thought had been destroyed. She had testimony from nurses who had been too afraid to speak up at the time but were willing to talk now. Most importantly, she had Patricia Hawthorne's medical records, the real ones, not the doctored versions James had submitted to the investigation board. Again, James said, and Sarah pushed with everything she had, channeling 5 years of rage and determination into bringing her child into the world. "I can see the head," Betty announced excitedly. "Beautiful hair." Sarah's heart swelled with love for the child she hadn't even met yet, but her eyes remained fixed on James. "Tell me, doctor, do you remember what you said to me the last time we spoke?" James's hands worked expertly, guiding the baby's emergence, but Sarah could see the sweat beading on his forehead. "Sarah, please, not now. You said I'd never practice medicine again. You said I'd never amount to anything. You said no one would ever believe me over you." Another push, and more of her baby appeared. "You were wrong about that last part." "One more big push," James said, his voice strained. "The shoulders are almost clear." Sarah pushed with everything she had, and suddenly her baby was there, crying lustily, perfect and healthy and beautiful. Betty immediately began cleaning the infant while James clamped and cut the cord. "It's a girl," Betty announced tearfully. "A beautiful baby girl." Sarah's heart exploded with joy and love as they placed her daughter on her chest. The tiny girl was perfect, with a shock of dark hair and the most beautiful eyes Sarah had ever seen. For a moment, all thoughts of revenge faded as she was overwhelmed by the miracle of her child. "Hello, Sweet pea, she whispered, kissing the baby's forehead. Mommy's here. Mommy's got you. Dr. Chase stepped forward, her expression warm. Congratulations, Sarah. She's absolutely perfect. The use of her first name wasn't lost on Sarah. Dr. Chase knew more than she was letting on. As James finished the delivery and began cleaning up, Sarah's mind returned to her plan. The folder wasn't the only weapon in her arsenal. She had spent 5 years building a new life, yes, but she had also spent 5 years preparing for this moment. Not the birth of her daughter, that was a beautiful surprise, but the moment when she would finally face James Harrison again and deliver the justice he had escaped for far too long. Dr. Harrison, she said sweetly, before you go, there's something I'd like to discuss with you. James looked up warily. I really should check on my other patients. Oh, but this won't take long, Sarah said, her smile sharp as a blade. You see, I have some paperwork I think you'd be very interested in reviewing. Betty was recording the baby's vital signs and didn't seem to be paying attention, but Sarah noticed Dr. Chase listening intently while she examined the placenta. Sarah, James said quietly, whatever you think you have, whatever you believe happened 5 years ago, pursuing this will only hurt you more. You have a daughter now. Think about her future. I am thinking about her future, Sarah replied, her voice steel wrapped in silk. I'm thinking about the world I want to leave her. A world where liars and murderers don't get to play God with other people's lives. Dr. Chase looked up from her work. Dr. Harrison, why don't you go file your paperwork? I'll finish up here with Mrs. Coleman. It wasn't really a suggestion, and James knew it. He nodded stiffly and headed for the door, but Sarah's voice stopped him. James. He turned back reluctantly. This isn't over. It's just beginning. After he left, Dr. Chase moved closer to Sarah's bed. How long have you been planning this? Sarah looked up sharply. I'm sorry. I've been head of obstetrics for 15 years, Dr. Chase said gently. I see everything that happens in this hospital. I also remember a very promising young surgeon named Dr. Sarah Mitchell who disappeared rather suddenly about 5 years ago. Sarah's heart pounded. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. Dr. Chase's voice was kind but firm. I also think that whatever you're planning, you might want to know that you're not the only one who's been watching Dr. Harrison very carefully. The word sent a chill down Sarah's spine. What do you mean? Dr. Chase glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard, then leaned closer. Let's just say that Patricia Hawthorne wasn't his only victim. And some of us have been waiting a very long time for someone brave enough to speak up. Before Sarah could respond, there was a commotion in the hallway. Raised voices, the sound of security being called, and then James burst back into the room, his face flushed and his eyes wild. You called them, he accused, pointing at Sarah. You called the Hawthorne family. Sarah's smile was triumphant. Actually, I didn't have to. They've been looking for you for quite some time. Through the doorway, Sarah could see two people she recognized from old photographs, Patricia Hawthorne's adult children, Michael and Jennifer. With them was a man in an expensive suit who could only be their lawyer. Dr. Harrison, Michael Hawthorne's voice carried clearly down the hall, we need to talk. James looked back at Sarah, his face pale with terror. What have you done? Justice, Sarah said simply, holding her baby closer. I've done justice. But then something incredible happened. Dr. Chase moved to the doorway and beckoned to someone Sarah couldn't see. Into the room walked an elderly man with silver hair and intelligent eyes, wearing a police detective's badge. Dr. Harrison, the detective said calmly, I'm Detective Frank Morrison. I think we need to have a conversation about several cases involving suspicious patient deaths over the past 6 years. James staggered backward as if he'd been struck. This is insane. This is a conspiracy. Sarah, you can't possibly think. I think, Sarah interrupted, that your patients deserved better. I think Patricia Hawthorne deserved better. I think the families who trusted you deserved better. Her voice grew stronger with each word. And I think it's time everyone knew the truth about the real Dr. James Harrison. Detective Morrison stepped forward with a manila folder thick with documents. Dr. Harrison, based on evidence provided by multiple sources, including hospital security footage, medical records, and testimony from several nurses who were present during various procedures, you're under arrest for medical malpractice, evidence tampering, and suspected homicide in the deaths of 4 patients. The room fell silent except for the baby's soft breathing. James looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. This is insane, he repeated. You can't prove anything. It's been years. The cases were closed. Actually, Detective Morrison said, opening his folder, cases involving medical malpractice never really close. They just wait for the right evidence to surface. And thanks to some very dedicated people, that evidence has finally come to light. Sarah watched as James was read his rights, her heart pounding with vindication and relief. As they led him away in handcuffs, he turned back one last time. Sarah, he called out desperately, please. Think about what you're doing to my family. My children. The same thing you did to mine, she replied coldly. The same thing you did to Patricia Hawthorne's family. The same thing you did to every family who trusted you with their lives. After James was gone, the room felt lighter somehow. Dr. Chase sat down in the chair beside Sarah's bed. How did you know? Sarah asked. I suspected something was wrong with the Mitchell case from the beginning, Dr. Chase admitted. The timeline didn't add up. The witnesses' stories kept changing. And James was just a little too eager to see you gone. But you didn't say anything. I couldn't prove anything then. But I kept watching. And when other suspicious deaths started piling up, I began keeping very detailed records. She smiled. When Detective Morrison contacted the hospital 6 months ago asking about unusual patterns in our surgical outcomes, I had quite a lot to share with him. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in 5 years, they were tears of relief rather than rage. I thought I was alone in this. You were never alone, Dr. Chase said gently. Justice has a way of bringing the right people together at the right time. Betty returned with discharge paperwork, beaming. Everything looks perfect for both mother and baby. You'll be able to go home tomorrow morning. As Sarah signed the papers, Dr. Chase leaned closer. There's one more thing you should know. The hospital board has been reviewing your case for the past 3 months. With the new evidence that's come to light, they're prepared to offer you full reinstatement of your medical license and a position here as soon as you're ready. Sarah's pen stopped moving. What? Dr. Sarah Mitchell, welcome back to medicine, Dr. Chase said with a warm smile. That is, if you want to come back. Sarah looked down at her daughter, sleeping peacefully in her arms, then back at Dr. Chase. I have a baby now. I don't know if I can. We have an excellent daycare facility, Dr. Chase interrupted. And a very understanding staff. Besides, we could use someone with your particular expertise in fighting for justice. Later that evening, after the visitors had gone and the hospital had settled into its nighttime quiet, Sarah sat in her bed holding her daughter and thinking about the future. For 5 years, she had lived for revenge. She had planned and plotted and sacrificed everything for this moment. But now, looking at her perfect little girl, she realized that revenge had only been the first chapter of her story. The real story was about redemption, about rebuilding, about creating a better world for the next generation. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Detective Morrison. Hawthorne family wants to meet with you. They want to thank you personally. Also, we've identified 2 more potential victims. Your testimony will be crucial for those cases. Sarah typed back, I'll be there. Whatever they need. Another message came in, this one from a number she didn't recognize. Dr. Mitchell, this is Jennifer Hawthorne. I wanted you to know that my mother would have been proud of what you did today. You gave our family something we thought we'd never have, the truth. Thank you. Sarah wiped away fresh tears and kissed her daughter's forehead. You know what, sweet pea? I think we're going to like our new life. The next morning brought a parade of visitors. The Hawthorne family came first, bringing flowers and heartfelt thanks. Michael Hawthorne, a man in his 40s with his mother's kind eyes, sat beside Sarah's bed and took her hand. For 5 years, we've lived with the guilt of accepting that settlement, he said quietly. We knew something wasn't right about Mom's death, but the hospital made it seem like pursuing it would just cause more pain for everyone. They lied to you too, Sarah said gently. James was very good at making people feel guilty for asking questions. Jennifer Hawthorne, a woman about Sarah's age, spoke up. Detective Morrison told us about what happened to you. How you lost your license because you tried to tell the truth about Mom's death. I can't imagine how hard these past 5 years have been. They were hard, Sarah admitted. But they led me here, to this moment, to finally getting justice for your mother. And to her. She looked down at her sleeping daughter. So in a way, I'm grateful. Dar. Chase arrived as the Hawthorns were leaving, carrying a large arrangement of flowers and a thick manila envelope. From the hospital board, she explained, setting the envelope on Sarah's bedside table. Your full reinstatement paperwork, along with an official apology and a rather substantial settlement for the wrongful termination 5 years ago. Sarah stared at the envelope. It's really happening. It's really happening. We've also received inquiries from 3 major medical journals wanting to publish your story. And there's interest from a publisher about a book deal. I don't know about all that, Sarah said. I just want to practice medicine again. To help people. That's exactly why you're the right person to tell this story, Dr. Chase said. Because it was never about fame or money for you. It was about doing what was right. The baby stirred in Sarah's arms, opening her eyes and looking up at her mother with an expression of perfect trust. Sarah felt her heart overflow with love and purpose. What are you going to name her? Dr. Chase asked. Sarah smiled. Hope. Her name is Hope Patricia Coleman. Perfect, Dr. Chase said softly. Absolutely perfect. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the hallway of Metropolitan General Hospital, wearing scrubs and a doctor's coat for the first time in 5 years. Her name tag read, Dr. Sarah Coleman, Pediatric Surgery. She had taken her maiden name back after her divorce was finalized. Hope was in the hospital daycare, charming the staff with her bright smile and happy disposition. Sarah could see her through the window, playing with colorful blocks and babbling contentedly. Ready for your first day back? Dr. Chase asked, joining her at the window. More than ready, Sarah said firmly. As they walked toward the surgical wing, Dr. Chase filled her in on the latest developments. James Harrison pled guilty to all charges last week. He'll serve a minimum of 15 years. The civil suits from the victims' families are ongoing, but his medical license has been permanently revoked. And the other cases Detective Morrison mentioned? 2 more families are getting the closure they deserve, thanks to your courage in speaking up. You started something important, Sarah. Other victims are finding their voices too. They passed the labor and delivery ward where Hope had been born, and Sarah felt a wave of gratitude for the strange twist of fate that had brought her face to face with James on that night. What had seemed like cruel irony at the time had actually been the universe's way of delivering justice. Dr. Coleman 2 or 3, came the announcement over the hospital's PA system. Dr. Coleman 2 or 3. Sarah's first surgery back was a routine appendectomy on a 10-year-old girl. As she scrubbed in, she thought about all the children she would help over the coming years, all the families she would serve, all the good she could do with this second chance. The operation went flawlessly. Sarah's hands were steady, her instincts sharp, her knowledge intact despite the 5-year hiatus. When she emerged from the OR, the little girl's parents were waiting anxiously. The surgery was a complete success, Sarah told them with a warm smile. Your daughter is going to be just fine. The relief and gratitude in their eyes reminded Sarah why she had fought so hard to return to medicine. This was her calling, her purpose, her way of healing the world one patient at a time. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment, holding Hope while she bottle-fed her and looked through the photo album she was creating. Pictures of Hope's first smile, her first laugh, her first day at the hospital daycare. But also pictures of the Hawthorne family at their mother's grave, finally able to visit without the burden of unanswered questions. Pictures of Sarah receiving her reinstatement papers. Pictures of James being led away in handcuffs. The album told the story of justice served and lives rebuilt. It was a story Sarah would someday tell Hope, when she was old enough to understand. A story about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. About how the truth always finds a way to surface, no matter how deeply it's buried. Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Detective Morrison. Dr. Coleman, I wanted to let you know that we've identified a 6th victim of Harrison's malpractice. The family contacted us after seeing the news coverage of his arrest. They want to thank you personally. Of course, Sarah said. Whatever they need. There's something else, Morrison continued. The DA's office is putting together a task force to investigate medical malpractice cases across the state. They want you to consult on cases where doctors might be covering up for each other. Sarah looked down at Hope, who had finished her bottle and was gazing up at her mother with trusting eyes. I'm interested, but I need to think about my daughter. They're offering flexible scheduling and the ability to work from home when needed. They really want your expertise, Dr. Coleman. What you did with the Harrison case, it's changing how we investigate these crimes. After hanging up, Sarah walked to the window of her apartment and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there were other James Harrisons, other doctors who thought they were above the law. Somewhere out there were other victims like herself and the Hawthorne family, people who deserved justice and truth. She had spent 5 years rebuilding her life from the ashes of James Harrison's betrayal. Now she had the chance to help others do the same. It wouldn't be easy, balancing her work at the hospital with consulting on criminal cases while raising Hope as a single mother. But she had learned something important over the past 5 years. She was stronger than she had ever imagined. What do you think, Hope? She asked her daughter softly. Should Mommy help catch the bad doctors? Hope gurgled happily and reached up to touch Sarah's face, as if giving her blessing to this new mission. 6 months later, Sarah stood at a podium addressing a packed auditorium at the American Medical Association's annual conference. Her keynote speech was titled, Courage in Medicine, When Staying Silent Becomes Complicity. In the audience sat Dr. Chase, Detective Morrison, the Hawthorne family, and dozens of other victims' families who had found justice because Sarah had been brave enough to speak up. Hope sat in the front row, being watched by a babysitter but beaming at her mommy on the big stage. Medical ethics isn't just about doing no harm, Sarah said into the microphone. It's about having the courage to speak up when we see harm being done. It's about protecting patients, even when it means standing up to colleagues, superiors, or entire institutions. The applause was thunderous. After the speech, Sarah was surrounded by doctors, nurses, and medical students who wanted to thank her, to share their own stories, to ask for advice on how to handle their own ethical dilemmas. One young resident, a woman about the age Sarah had been when she first encountered James Harrison, approached nervously. Dr. Coleman, I think I'm seeing something wrong at my hospital. A surgeon who might be cutting corners. Making mistakes. But he's the department head, and I'm just a resident. No one will believe me. Sarah took the young woman's hands in hers. What's your name? Dar. Emily Chen. Dr. Chen, I want you to remember something. Your medical license doesn't make you just a doctor. It makes you a guardian. A protector. A voice for patients who can't speak for themselves. Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. If you see something wrong, you have an obligation to report it. And if the people at your hospital won't listen, there are people who will. Sarah handed her a business card. This is Detective Morrison. He heads the Medical Crimes Task Force. And this, she handed her another card, is my direct number. You don't have to face this alone. Dr. Chen's eyes filled with tears of relief. Thank you. I was so scared. Fear is normal, Sarah said. But courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is doing what's right despite the fear. As the conference ended and people began to file out, Sarah gathered hope in her arms and walked to the parking garage. Her phone was buzzing with interview requests, speaking engagements, and consultation offers. The book about her experience was being published next month, with proceeds going to a foundation she had established to help healthcare workers report medical misconduct safely. Mommy's getting famous, she told Hope, who giggled and grabbed at her mother's hair. But don't worry, sweet pea. No matter how busy Mommy gets, you'll always come first. As they drove home, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 5 years ago, she had been a broken woman with nothing left to lose. Tonight, she was a successful surgeon, a published author, a sought-after consultant, and most importantly, a mother raising a daughter who would grow up knowing that justice is worth fighting for. Her phone rang, and she answered it hands-free. Dr. Coleman, this is Dr. Martinez at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. We have a situation here that we think might require your expertise. And that's how justice was served. Sometimes karma takes time, but it never misses. When we stand up for what's right, even in our darkest moments, we don't just change our own lives, we change the world for everyone who comes after us. Proof that every villain gets what they deserve, and every hero finds their way home. Subscribe for more incredible stories of justice and redemption.